Yo, what's going on, snipers? And finally, welcome to our 2006-07 roster build overviews. So I have finished my 2006-07 rosters for pre-deadline and post-deadline. This is the post-deadline roster I'm going to be showing you guys in this video, but there is going to be a pre-deadline roster, which includes moving players back to certain teams they started the season on. So example, like Craig Conroy went to the Calgary Flames later in the season, but in the pre-deadline roster he will be on the Los Angeles Kings. Same with, like, say, guys like Sean Avery was also in Los Angeles, but after the deadline he was in New York. So there's a little bit of a difference between the two of those, so you guys could always choose between the two of those rosters for you to use for a franchise mode if you want to use them for franchise mode. Once roster sharing comes out, hopefully it still comes out on time. As well as there is going to be a 1996-97 post-deadline roster that should be out for day one of roster sharing as well. I've been working hard on it. I'm still working on it as we speak, but I'd like to get that out for day one as well. And if I can, I might do a pre-deadline roster for that as well too. So that would be 4 different rosters for you guys to use for franchise modes and all that type of thing, or just play against the AI, because that's also a lot of fun doing with these roster builds. So anyways, let's get into the jerseys for each and every team, even though there is a little bit of problems right now because there is still some glitches that EA needs to fix. And then we will get into the rosters for each individual team. I'll also leave timestamps in this video so you guys could go to each specific team that you want to see. But I would really appreciate it if you guys stuck around as long as you could, because these obviously take a long time to make, because this roster in general has taken over a year to build, in a sense, because I had to make a spreadsheet and all that type of thing. So I would really appreciate it if you could stick around as long as you can, but I understand that you guys have lives, so if you have other stuff to do, just feel free to click through the video and find your favorite team's roster or a team you would like to see, and so on and so forth. But anyways, let's get into those jerseys. Okay, let's get into the jerseys for the Stanley Cup winning Anaheim Ducks, which still kind of hurts to say that because obviously me being a Sens fan, but here is what the Honda Center looks like. And as you can see, this is the logos I used for Anaheim, which is only just the D kind of duck logo, whatever you want to call it, the duck foot. And this is what their home jersey looks like. Obviously you could use the actual jerseys in game because there is actual good jerseys for 2006-07, so you don't need to necessarily use my custom teams. But if you want to have like more of a looking franchise that looks like it was around in 2006-07, then I would recommend replacing the current teams with my custom teams, which I will also probably be doing a video explaining how to use my rosters for franchise mode so they best work possible. But that's their home jersey, looks pretty good. And then there is the away jersey, which is pretty much just reversed, and obviously they didn't have a alternate during this point in time, and I left that one blank obviously. So those are the two jerseys they have. Now let's get into the jerseys for the Atlanta Thrashers, which obviously the Atlanta Thrashers do not have a logo in this game, so we have to go with that one I used for the 2002-03 build. If you guys remember, I did an 02-03 build last year, and then like year prior did like 93-94 and stuff like that, so I've been doing a lot of different builds over the years. But this is the Phillips Arena. Looks pretty good, I think. I'm not 100% sure if it's 100% accurate, but these are also the logos I used. These two logos, I didn't use obviously that one, but this one I used for kind of more like that kind of like flying logo. I don't really know how to explain it, but that's what I used, and these are the 3 colors just in case you guys want to make these teams yourself. But then again, when roster sharing comes, if created teams are included in that, you guys get downloaded and you'll get my created teams. If for some reason you don't get the created teams, then obviously you guys are gonna have to look off my spreadsheet, which will be linked below. Now this is their home jersey. Looks pretty good. I think it turned out well. We used the Sens font as the backing, obviously because the Sens font is the closest thing to the Atlanta Thrashers font. And yeah, the colors turned out really nice on this jersey, and then the away one also looks pretty good, but I think I'm more of a fan of this home jersey. And back in these days, they also didn't have an alternate, so they do not have a actual alternate jersey in this. But a few years later, they'd have like a different jersey. So if you want to, when this like roster build, you download it, if you have the ability to edit my teams, you could always make yourself a 3rd jersey if you'd like to. But for realism, I don't give them jerseys that they didn't have at that point in time. Now we go on to the Boston Bruins, and Boston's jerseys really haven't changed a whole lot. They kind of look similar. They don't look that great. Like, you could use the ones in game and they look a lot better, I would say. But these are the logos I use. So we have the normal spoked B. We have a spoked B with a yellow outline instead, because this is more for their alternate jersey, which I'll show you guys. And then this is I believe the Utah Grizzlies logo. I used it because obviously it's closest to the shoulder patch logo with the bear on it. So I decided just to use it as that one. And yeah, that's basically why I use that logo. And this is the team uniform. So here is the home jersey. Obviously doesn't look like kind of like their actual one. Their actual one had more yellow down the kind of side arms a little bit. But like I said, you guys could use the real ones if you'd like to. And then here is the away one. Looks pretty good, just like kind of reversed in color. And then the alternate jersey looks pretty nice as well. Like I said, with that yellow B logo, which I think I really like this one the most. Kind of looks more similar to their current ones, obviously, except for the logo is a bit different. Okay, so now that we've seen the Boston Bruins, also Boston actually has a different goal horn I forgot to mention. It's more sounding like... I'm trying to remember what it sounds like more. It sounds more like a... I don't remember what team exactly, but it does sound a lot different than it currently does. But yeah, it's kind of a little bit different in current times. So now we go on to Buffalo. If it would load, there you go. So we used, once again, another team logo that was like a custom team logo. So this one's the closest you could get to like the Buffalo Slug and create a team. I also made using the B logo, kind of like what they would have with the sword across it. So there's that. And then currently the actual Buffalo Sabres logo actually has some glitch problem where wherever you put colors, it will like basically do reverse of what you want. So you can never get the actual jersey or actual logo to work on the jersey. So right now, hopefully they fix that glitch. Hopefully by the time you guys see this, maybe they fix that glitch. If not, maybe when roster sharing comes. But yeah, that logo obviously is not supposed to look like that. It's supposed to look like this, which I'll probably put a logo up on the screen. You guys probably already know how it looks anyways. But yeah, that's that. And then the team uniforms here at HSBC Arena looks like this. Looks pretty sick. I really like this one. It turned out really well. And then the away one looks like this. Yeah, these jerseys turned out really nice for the most part. And then the alternate obviously was kind of similar to what they have nowadays, but with the same pants as the home jerseys and away jerseys. But yeah, that logo currently is bugged. As you can see, it shows blue on the inside, but as I was showing you guys in this logo screen, it is yellow. So it's kind of a weird glitch where it inverts the logo completely. So hopefully once they fix that, that jersey looks a lot better and the actual way it's supposed to look from back in those days. Now we're going to get into the Calgary Flames, who their jerseys really aren't anything spectacular. They're nice jerseys, but yeah, they're pretty much just the same almost as what they've been for a while. Well, in terms of how they look and to an extent. But as you can see, here is their home jersey. I also gave them the Kansas City Mavericks logo for the like blasty logo on the shoulders. Looks pretty good. And then there is their away jersey, and they did not have an alternate during this time and period, but obviously before this they would have had like Blasty and stuff like that. And then for logos, there's their logos, so they have two different versions of the Calgary Flames logo and also the Kansas City Mavericks logo, as I was mentioning, and there's the colors. Now we got to get into Carolina, who was coming off a Stanley Cup win, but they didn't make the playoffs, I'm pretty sure, in this season. It's kind of a weird team to an extent that they went from winning a cup to missing out on the playoffs, but they went through a lot of changes over the time period since. So here's their logos. Once again, it's just these two logos. It's just like the flag and stuff like that, the ones that they kind of currently use. And then their color scheme looks like this. And then we go to their team uniforms. Here is their home jersey, which looks similar to what they have nowadays. Obviously, it's a little bit different because than the actual jersey itself, because the actual jersey itself had a little bit of gray on it as well near the black part on the bottom. But obviously I can't add that because this game is a little bit restrictive in terms of creativity. There is their away jersey, which is just reversed, and they didn't have their alternate till 2008-09, which was that nice black jersey. So once again, if you want to add jerseys to these rosters, you can always do that, and even you could use these rosters to build up off upon it and make a future season if you'd really like to. Then we get to Chicago, which their roster and their jersey looks the exact same pretty much as it's always been. Once again, here's their logos. So we got two different shoulder logos and one regular logo. Colors are red, black, and white as per usual. And in their team uniforms, this is their home jersey. Looks pretty much what they have nowadays. Their away jersey looks like this. And then their alternate jersey, which is a really nice one. I really like this black jersey. Like, if I was to get a Blackhawks jersey, it'd probably be this one. Just because I really like the looks of the black jersey in general. They are a bit expensive though to buy, so I will probably never be able to get one, but they're still pretty sick. Then we're going to get into the Colorado Avalanche, who had an interesting team this year for the most part. A lot of young guys jumping into their roster and all that sort of thing, as well as some good veterans, which we will see when we get to the rosters. But once again, their logos look like this, so I use like the kind of like the Coyotes like paw as kind of like the foot logo that they have on the shoulder, just because there was nothing really else. I could have left it blank, but yeah, that's basically what I used. And then the normal Colorado logo, and also a C with like a cursive look kind of to it. The reason being on this is because their alternate jersey had like a thing that say Colorado across it, so that's why I used that as the tertiary logo. As for their uniforms, they look like this. Pretty much like what they look like nowadays, but like once I said, I put that paw print in as the foot logo, and then there is their away jersey, and then their alternate jersey looks pretty spiffy. It looks like this. Now I could use just like the normal Colorado logo on the front of this, but I decided just to try and put a letter instead, but it looks pretty good. Turned out really well. I really like this one. Definitely reminds me of those days of the Avs with like Joe Sakic in the earlier 2000s, or early to mid 2000s, I should say. Now we get into Columbus, and obviously the logo is not going to be as accurate as the one that would be already in the games. So once again, you could use the in-game jerseys. I recommend that actually if you're just playing games for the 2006-07 build, because they look the exact same. So we have this logo, and then the colors blue, red, and white. Not a surprise. Then we go to the team uniforms, and this is what they look like. They don't look 100% accurate, but I think they still look pretty nice, and they definitely encapsulate what the Ohio type of jerseys look like. And then their away jersey looks like this. Once again, doesn't look 100% accurate. Kind of wish that old logo was in the game. And then the alternate jersey looks pretty accurate because this logo was actually on this jersey. It kind of looks weird with the black kind of like shoulders and stuff like that, but that was all on the jersey back in these days. So these ones are mostly accurate, but yeah, that's pretty much that. I can definitely see like Rick Nash wearing those for sure. And then we get into the Dallas Stars, and Dallas also, actually, we'll get to the All-Star teams probably last, because we do have some All-Star teams, the Dallas East All-Stars and the Dallas West All-Stars, which are pretty interesting teams, but because the All-Star game was in Dallas that year, that's why I made it named Dallas. But for the actual Dallas Stars themselves, playing at American Airlines Arena, here's what their logos look like. So currently there's a bug also on this logo, as you can see where the black part is. It needs to be fixed, so I like try and put green there, but for some reason it doesn't even register that I'm trying to put green there, and it just keeps it black, so that needs to be fixed. But for the other two logos, these are just shoulder logos, which has the state of Texas with a star in it. It looks pretty good, pretty much what they had on their jerseys at that point in time, so that's why I did that. And then green, black, and white are their colors. As for their jerseys, they look like this. I'm not 100% sure if the color green I got is really that good. It's really hard to find the exact color of green to use for Dallas Stars jerseys, but that's what I used. And then their away jersey looks like this, like how those turned out. And they didn't have an alternate back in these days. Now, the Muteris was around in 05-06, but it was the last year it was used, I'm pretty sure. So if you want to, you could always try and make a Muteris, because there is definitely logo options to make a Muteris if you would like to. Then we get into the Detroit Red Wings, and their jerseys have not changed at all. Because obviously their jerseys have been kind of like historic jerseys for a long time. So logo obviously just has one logo, and in red, white, and red, because they don't really have more than two colors. And then there is their home jersey, looks pretty much what they have nowadays, and their away jersey. And obviously they didn't have an alternate during this time period, and they have never really had an alternate, I guess you could say. So except for like when those like practice looking jerseys came out recently. Now we go on to the Edmonton Oilers, and Edmonton's got some pretty nice jerseys for this time period. This was during the like navy and copper era, so this is Rexall Place, I believe. So there is their home logo. Then we also got the oil drop logo, which I really like this logo, obviously, and the jersey that they are on. And then their colors are navy, this I don't even really know how to explain this color, kind of like an oil color, and white. And then we go to their uniforms. This is what their home jersey looks like. It looks pretty good. Definitely reminds me of that 05-06 Cup run for them. And then there's their away jersey. And it's kind of weird that it has red on it, but it is what it is. That's what they used. And then their alternate jersey with the oil drop turned out really good. I think it looks really nice. The font is obviously not 100% accurate, but it is the closest we could get in terms of how the font looked. So that is the Edmonton Oilers. Now we'll make our way over to Florida and take a look at their jerseys. They pretty much haven't really changed a whole lot up to like 2016 or something like that before they unveiled their new logo, which they currently still have. But their logo in this is this nice little panther. And then these two logos are also shoulder logos. So you got one with a red outline and one with a navy outline. The reason being is because on the shoulders, obviously there's one with red shoulders and one with navy shoulders. So it's to get that background to blend in. And then their colors are navy, red, and yellow. Then we go to their team uniforms. Their home jersey looks like this. Not 100% accurate, but still looks pretty good and definitely reminds me of those earlier Florida days. The away jersey looks like this. Turned out pretty well. And then their alternate jersey is the red jersey. I think this one looks pretty nice as well. So those are the jerseys for Florida. Now we'll make our way over to the West and go to the Los Angeles Kings and their jerseys, which also look pretty good because obviously I'm a really big fan of like the black and purple era that the Los Angeles Kings had. Like I actually own one of their jerseys. You guys would have seen it probably on my stream that I had a couple months ago. So there's their only logo we have. We also got this nice purple color. We got black and white as the colors. And then the team uniforms obviously look like this. Not 100% accurate. Font looks pretty good though. And I think in general these jerseys turned out really nice. And then away is pretty much just reversed. And then we got their alternate jersey, which is a nice purple jersey. I would really like to own the purple jersey, but right now I have a black one like this. So at some point maybe I'll try and get a purple one, but they are pretty expensive as well because obviously they are a desirable jersey to get from back in these days. Which I guess I could say back in these days because this is 14 years ago, which is crazy because this is a kind of like a season I remember a lot about because obviously my favorite team went to the Cup Finals and lost, and I remember like babysitting my cousins during that time period, which is pretty crazy. So this is the Minnesota Wild. We're at the XL Energy Center. There's their logo, and I put this as kind of like the logo that said Wild on their shoulder. You could use this if you'd like to. You don't have to. And then they have green, red, and white as their colors, kind of similar to like a Christmas theme, I guess you could say. And then this is their home jersey. Turned out really well. Obviously, again, the color, I'm not 100% sure if I got the right accuracy of green, but I think it turned out pretty good. And then their away jersey is pretty much just reversed. And they do also have a nice alternate jersey, which looks like this. I think this one is probably one of my favorite jerseys from the Minnesota Wild from the like 06-07 season, or from their entire history probably. Turns out pretty well. Obviously the logo is not accurate because their logo actually was like kind of like in a circular logo. But obviously there is none of that in this game because this game has like a very small margin of actual logos from the past because of copyright issues. They obviously can't have them all. So now we go into the Montreal Canadiens, and once again their jerseys haven't really changed that much like a lot of original 6 teams. But as you can see, we have their normal logo and their normal color palette. And then we go into the team uniforms. They look like this. Once again, it looks pretty similar to what they have nowadays. Their away jersey looks like this. Looks pretty good. And they actually do have an alternate back in these days, which has the white jersey with the like thing going across the chest. I think this jersey is probably one of my favorite Habs jerseys. If I was to buy a Habs jersey, it would probably be from this era. It'd probably be like a Saku Koivu, but I don't think I've ever seen one of those. But yeah, those are some nice Habs jerseys, those ones. The rest of the Habs jerseys I'm not a huge fan of, but definitely that one is pretty nice. Now we go into a team that has some pretty nice jerseys, at least for the alternate, in Nashville. And we will take a look at their logos. Their logo, obviously, I had to use the current one. It's a bit different than what they had back in these days. And then the colors are navy, yellow, white. As for the team uniform itself, this is what their home jersey looks like. Not 100% accurate, and I'm not really sure if that gray is that good, but I think it turned out pretty well. Here is the away jersey, which is pretty much just reversed. And then their alternate jersey, which is probably my favorite jersey in this roster build. Looks something like that with the nice golden looking color. This is supposed to be like the, whatever that saber-tooth guy is called. People always call him something, but I can't remember what it is. But yeah, that's Nashville. And then we make our way on to New Jersey, who my Sens had to play in the second round of the playoffs back in 06-07. I remember it quite well because I remember in one of the overtimes, Jamie Langenbrunner scored it, and we lost that game. I remember watching that game with my mom when I was babysitting. So yeah, there's their colors and stuff like that, pretty much the exact same as they've always been. Here is their home jersey. Looks pretty good. And then there is their away jersey. And then obviously they didn't have an alternate up until just this season. And speaking of that alternate, it looks like trash, according to me. Eventually people will like it probably, but right now I don't think it's a good jersey. But I have seen worse, so I'll say it at that. Now we go on to the New York Islanders, who were kind of an interesting team in how they were built up this year because they did bring in a lot of random pieces this season. Obviously, at the deadline, they brought in like Ryan Smith, who will be in this roster build on the Islanders, but in the prior deadline build, he'd be on the Edmonton Oilers, so it depends really which one you'd like to use. But yeah, their colors pretty much haven't changed since. A little bit, I guess, the blue. But yeah, here's their home jersey. Looks pretty good. Obviously, I can't get the shoulder logo that they had back in these days, which I think was just like a few stripes. And then their away jerseys just pretty much looks like this. Looks similar to what they have nowadays, but a different shade of blue. And then their alternate jersey looks something like this, which I think this alternate jersey turned out pretty nice. Their real-life alternate is also probably one of my favorite Islanders jerseys, so I'd like to own this at some point. But I think this turned out pretty well. Looks a little bit different, though, when you have an orange jersey and you also have, like, navy socks to it, so those look pretty good. Now we'll get into the New York Rangers, who have some really nice jerseys as well. Well, obviously one of them, which a lot of you guys should probably know, which is like the Lady Liberty jersey. I'll show you guys that. But in terms of the Rangers jerseys, obviously back in these days and current days, they actually have like a thing that says Rangers across on their jerseys. We can't do that in this game, which is really annoying. So I have to use this logo as their like logo on their chest. So the jerseys aren't going to look 100% accurate at all, but the alternate jersey with the Lady Liberty should look pretty good when I show you guys that. So here is their home jersey. Like I said, we had to use this logo because there's no way to just get it to say Rangers across like it is in real life. But I think these still turned out pretty well. And then the away jersey looks something like this. So it's pretty much, if you guys don't want to use my jerseys, once again, you could use the actual ones that EA has, and they look a lot better. And then the alternate jersey with the Lady Liberty. This is probably one of my favorite jerseys in this game as well, and in this roster build. Definitely, you guys could probably see like Jaromir Jagr wearing this and whatnot. I have taken a lot of screenshots using this roster build and posted them on Twitter before, so you guys might have seen some of the screenshots with these jerseys before. Now we get into the Ottawa Senators, or actually the North American Future Stars. I forgot to mention. So basically, since Seattle and Vegas didn't exist back in these days, we have to replace them with created teams pretty much to add up to the 32 teams. So the North America Future Stars are replacing Seattle. And then there's a team called the Europe United, which I'll also have to show you guys because I passed them. They replaced Vegas. So those are basically the two created teams in this roster build, just to make sure we have enough. North America Future Stars are comprised of future players that basically played in like the CHL, and they also played in like college hockey and stuff like that. So it's a fully customized team. So they didn't actually exist, but it is still a fun team to use, because obviously they have a lot of potential, but their overall out of the gate is not super that good. So this is what I made their home jersey looks like, and then this is what I made their away jersey look like. I don't think I gave them an alternate. Yeah, I didn't give them an alternate because a lot of teams didn't have alternates during these days. But yeah, that's basically that team. You could use that team if you'd like to, or you could still just like use the normal Seattle jerseys and stuff like that. I'll also show you guys, I guess, Europe now, since I forgot to do that earlier. This Europe United team is comprised of former and future NHLers that played overseas during 06-07. So guys that played in like the SHL and all that type of thing, and the SM Liga. And yeah, so their main logo looks like this, and then there is their alternate logo. and those are their color scheme. Pretty much I used the exact same look as I used in the 2002-03 build, because if you guys watched that video, I did also have to Europe United during that roster build. So yeah, this is basically what their home jersey looks like. Kind of looks like St. Louis Blues like, and there is their away jersey, and I don't think, yeah, I didn't give them an alternate. So yeah, a little bit on that. So those are the two custom teams. Like I said, you don't have to use them, but it's recommended just because obviously Seattle and Vegas didn't exist back in those days. But basically the players for these teams are all assigned to those teams. So if you want to replace Seattle and Vegas, you have to replace them with the accurate ones on those. That's why I'll probably be making a video at some point explaining on how to use this roster build for franchise mode. Now we get into the Ottawa Senators jerseys, which is obviously my favorite team. Their logo is currently bugged, which is really annoying. As you can see, I made it look like this, which is how it should look. And then we have these other two logos, but the annoying thing is, as you can see in the middle of the ice, the logo is inverted as well. So it has another inverse problem similar to Buffalo's logo, and I hope that they fix it soon, because right now the jerseys do not look accurate at all. Like, this looks kind of accurate. Obviously the shoulder has that glitch problem, and then the away one, as you can see, that logo is fully bugged out because it's not even close to what I put it as. So hopefully they fix that, and hopefully that is ready to go for roster sharing. And then the alternate jersey is the black jersey. Not 100% accurate, obviously, because that 3D Sens logo wasn't what they actually had back in these days, but it's the closest thing we got. So that's the jerseys for the Sens. And now we make our way on to the Philadelphia Flyers, which are another team that hasn't really changed their jerseys too much in their logos, obviously. So they're pretty similar to what they have nowadays, to an extent, I guess you could say. So their logo obviously is that, and then their colors haven't changed. We go to their uniforms, and here is their home jersey, which is the nice black jersey. We also have the away one, which is pretty much reversed with some orange shoulders. And then their alternate jersey, which is a pure orange jersey that also has some like gray on the text and the font. I actually own one of these jerseys, and I'd like to get it customized to say like Gagne on it, but I haven't gotten enough money to do that yet. But yeah, these are probably one of my favorite Flyers jerseys, just because it reminds me of back in the day when the Sens and the Flyers had like a brawl. That was like one of the first hockey games I remember really watching on TV back in those days. Back in actually 2003, so earlier than this, like pre-lockout. So now we're on to the Phoenix Coyotes, and here is their logo, obviously coming off like the Kachina stuff in 2002-03. Like, they've had these jerseys from 03-04 to 06-07, and then obviously it changed around a bit in 07-08. But there's their logos and their shoulder logos and the colors that they used. Then we go to the team uniforms. This is what their home jersey looks like. It looks pretty much the exact same as what they actually had. So it looks pretty nice. And then their away jersey looks like that. I actually really like these jerseys. A lot of people don't really like this era of Coyotes jerseys, but I really like how the white one looks. I own one of the white ones. The only thing really about the white one is it has kind of like a really weird V-neck, so that's the only problem really with it. And they didn't have an alternate back in these days, but once again, you could add the black one from 08-09 if you so desire. Now we're going to get into the Pittsburgh Penguins, who my Sens also had to play in the playoffs back in the first round of the 06-07 playoffs. They actually played them a lot in the playoffs, because I remember watching them play like in 07-08 and all that type of thing as well. It was getting quite annoying having to play the Penguins so much, but there is their home logo. And then there is their colors with this like weird kind of like cream yellow color. Then we get into their uniforms. Here is what their home jerseys look like. Obviously I can't make them 100% accurate, but I think they turned out pretty well. And then here is their away jersey, pretty much just reversed. And they did not have an alternate in these days, but if you wanted to, you could even make like the Winter Classic jerseys they had in 08-09 or something like that. Now we get into the San Jose Sharks, which were a really good team this year. Obviously they had like Joe Thornton and stuff like that. Jonathan Chichu was coming off a really good season. So it's a quite an interesting team here in San Jose. So here's their logo. Obviously it's not the exact logo, but I had to black out the entire shark pretty much to make them look similar. And then I also used the Arizona like moon logo as kind of like the fin logo that they had on the shoulders. So that is there. And then there's their color scheme. And then we go to the team uniforms. This is what I made their home jersey look like. It's not 100% accurate, but I think it still turned out pretty decently. And then this is your away jersey. Once again, if you want to use more accurate jerseys, just use EAs. And then the alternate ones look like this. I think this alternate jersey turned out really well as well. I really like the black colors, obviously, on it. and it looks a lot different than the other ones. This is probably one of my favorite jerseys also in this roster build. Now we get into the St. Louis Blues, and their jerseys are pretty similar to what they are nowadays, so it's nothing spectacular, but they still look pretty good. A lot of these like 06, 07 jerseys kind of are very nostalgic for me because obviously this is one of the first full seasons I really remember watching, so other than 05, 06, I remember watching the playoffs for that. So there's their two logos, just two different variations of the Blues logo. And then there's the color palette. And then we go to the team uniforms. Here is what their home jersey looks like, pretty much what they have nowadays. And their away jersey looks like this. And they didn't have an alternate during these days, but once again, you can make an alternate if you so desire. And I actually recommend if you would like to make alternates, you should. And I actually have made the most alternates for all these teams from like other games, so I might know how to actually make them. If you'd like to ask me, I could probably give you some suggestions on how to make the alternates from these days. So for the Tampa Bay Lightning, now this is an interesting one. Obviously, they don't have the logo in the game from back in these days, but we have just two different variations of the current Tampa Bay logo, which one is a white logo and one is a gray logo. And then the color scheme obviously is black, blue, and white. And the team uniforms look something like this. So the home jersey, I think they actually turned out pretty good even though the logo isn't accurate. So there is the home one, and the away one looks something like this. And back in these days, obviously didn't have an alternate. But prior to this, in like the 97 build, for example, they'll have a blue alternate jersey, which used to be like the Storm jersey. So just a little heads up on that front. Then we go to the Toronto Maple Leafs, and once again, they are another team that hasn't really changed a lot of jerseys over the years. Obviously, they did change their logo in like 15, 16, I think it was, so that's a little bit different. But we have three different logos here. We have the white one that has the blue font. We also have the blue one with the white font, and then we also have their current logo. And yeah, there's basically their color palette. Then we go to their team uniforms. They look something like this. Definitely brings back the days of my sons playing against like Matt Sundin and all that type of thing. I think those turned out pretty well. Here's their away jersey, which is pretty much just reversed. And then their alternate jersey, which was a white alternate. You didn't have a lot of white alternates in the league, so that's kind of an interesting one. But yeah, it's this one. So it looks pretty good using the current logo. Now we make our way on to the Vancouver Canucks, and then we also have Washington, and then we'll get into the All-Star logos and jerseys. And then we'll get into the actual rosters themselves at that point. So for Vancouver, obviously their jerseys have gone through a lot of changes since to an extent. So this is what their home jersey looks like, or home logo looks like, I should say. Looks like that. Then we have two different variations of their current logo. So this one was like a shoulder logo, but this one is for their alternate jersey because their alternate jersey looks kind of similar to what their current jersey looks like. So that's why it's there. We go to the team uniforms. This is what their home jersey looks like. I think it turned out pretty nice. Definitely could see like Marcus Naslund wearing this. And then their away one is pretty much just reversed. And then their alternate, as I was mentioning, looks pretty similar to what they currently have, or the closest thing that they have to their similar one that they use right now. And I think it turned out pretty nice as well. So now we go on to Washington, and then we get into the two All-Star teams, which should be pretty fun. And then we'll get into the rosters. So Washington also has a bugged logo, which is kind of annoying. Hope that they fix it. It's definitely something that I really need to get fixed because it looks like trash otherwise. But as you can see, this is how I had the logo set up. The red part isn't actually supposed to be red. I tried to change the color, but it doesn't change the color for it. So once again, it's another one of those type of glitches. But that's their logo. And as you can see, it's reversed, like it's inverted on the middle of the ice, like it looks white. So right now it looks like trash, but it definitely needs to be fixed. And yeah, it doesn't look anything like how I was trying to put it as. So yeah, that's that. This is the home jersey. This one actually would have a thing that had like the Capitol building on it, but obviously that Capitol building logo isn't in the game. So once again, if you would like to, you could use the actual ones in game, and they look just as good. And then the away one looks like this. Once that logo gets fixed, this will look a lot better, but right now it looks like trash. And then for alternates, they did not have an alternate during this time period. So those are the jerseys for the Washington Capitals. Now let's get into the two All-Star team jerseys, which are pretty similar. Both of them are the exact same type of build, except for one is a white base with some red, and then the other one's a full-on blue one, so they're very similar. But as you can see here, once it loads up, this is basically the American Airlines Arena again. and because the All-Star game was in Dallas that season. Basically, the logos have just changed a bit. So this is the NHL logo for the All-Star team in the East. They have a red logo, and they also have this kind of logo I decided to use because it kind of looked similar to the Dallas All-Star game logo that they had. And then their main colors are red, gray, and white. And then they only have one jersey throughout their all three jerseys, and it's the exact same for all of them, and it looks like this. Looks pretty good. I think it turned out pretty well. You got the nice stars on the pants as well to kind of give it more of an all-star feel. And yeah, that looks pretty nice, I think. And then yeah, the Western Conference All-Stars are pretty much the exact same, just a little bit different, where they don't have as much white. They have more blue base and a little bit of white and gray as well. So I'll show you guys that. So, as I was mentioning, the arena stays the exact same for the All-Star West team. They got the blue instead of the red. Logo stays the exact same there, and then this logo just changes from red to blue. And then in terms of the team uniform, it basically stays the exact same, except for it's now just blue in the spots where it was white, pretty much, I think. And then also on the logo, obviously, it changes a little bit. But it looks pretty good as well. I really like these blue ones especially. I kind of wish I owned one to an extent. So those are all the jerseys for all 34 teams, I guess, in this roster build, considering these two All-Star teams and then the 32 regular teams. Now comes the fun part of going over each team's roster. So we'll go through every single team's rosters, like their lineup and all that type of thing, and then that'll be pretty much it. We'll also show you guys a few other additions I have, which are pretty neat, which includes similar goaltenders in the AHL system for almost every team, as well as there is some draft prospects for the first 3 years of the draft for those of you that are playing franchise mode. So yeah, let's get into those rosters for the Anaheim Ducks. So here's the roster for the Stanley Cup winning Anaheim Ducks. And now I want to kind of note before we actually go over the roster that every player almost in this roster build does have X factors. And the reason being is because some players were better at certain things than others. So example here with Chris Kunitz, he was a very good hitter. He has truculence. Then you have somebody like Andy McDonald, who was good at faceoffs and good at passing. He's got good quick draw. He's got tape to tape. And then you have somebody like Solani, who was a really good shooter and whatnot. He's got a lot of shooting categories, that type of thing. So pretty much everybody in this entire build has some X factors tied to them. There's some players that don't, just because I don't really know what to give them. But other than that, let's just get through their roster. So first line has Timo Solani, Andy McDonald, and Chris Kunitz, as I was saying, a pretty damn good first line. Solani being one of the best players on this Ducks team for sure. Second line wise, you have some young players like Dustin Penner and Ryan Getzlav, alongside of a veteran in Rob Niedermayer, who was good early in his career in terms of offense, but he kind of really slowed down as he was getting older and becoming more of a defensive forward. But he is on the second line as a winger instead of a centerman like he normally would be. Third line wise, you got Travis Moen, who's got truculence, so he could throw some hits. Kind of actually like a physical third line to an extent, which actually really explains the Ducks to an extent too, because the Ducks were a very physical kind of team and a very defensive minded team to an extent. So yeah, they got Todd Marchand at center and Corey Perry in his second season as well. So three really good young guys, and Corey Perry should be one of those players that are very hard to play against around the net and behind the net and in front of the net, just based on all the X factors I gave him. Then on the fourth line, you got Ryan Shannon in his first season with Sammy Paulson and also Sean Thornton. Then on to the defensive core, you had some pretty good defensemen here. You got Francois Beauchemin, who's pretty underrated at blocking shots and throwing hits. You got Scott Niedermayer, who's really good, obviously being the captain of this team. You also got Chris Pronger, so two very good defenders, two of the best defensemen in this build, actually. Two of the top four, I should say. And you also got Sean O'Donnell. And then on the top six, you got Kent Huskins and Joe DePenta. As for goaltenders, obviously, you got J.S. Jaguar, who was a really good goaltender this season. This was, I think, his best season of his career, if I'm not mistaken. And in his backup, you got Ilya Brzgalov, who was also a pretty solid goaltender and also afraid of Bears. And then they also have no depth in this build because of the 600 skater limit, but I did have to cut a few players that could have been in this build, so including like Tim Brent, Brad May was cut from this build, George Peros, and Rick Jackman were the notable ones that had the cut for the Anaheim Ducks. Now we get into the Atlanta Thrashers, who actually made the playoffs this year. This was the only time they ever never made the playoffs before they disbanded and became the Winnipeg Jets. So top line wise, you got Ilya Kovalchuk with Eric Belanger, who came over from Carolina, so he will be in Carolina in the pre-deadline build if you were to use that. We also have Marian Hossa here, who had a very good season this year. He had 100 points and 43 goals. Second line wise, you got Pascal Dupuis, who started the season in Minnesota, but then also got moved a couple more times before landing in Atlanta. You also got Keith Tkachuk, who came over from St. Louis, which is a little bit of a weird one because Keith Tkachuk wasn't there that long, because he would go back to St. Louis, I'm pretty sure, in the offseason after this. And you also got Slava Kozlov. Third line wise, you got John Sim, Bobby Holik, and Scott Mellanby. Scott Mellanby being in his last season, and Bobby Holik being a very good centerman. Mellanby is actually the captain of this team, which is kind of interesting. Then on the fourth line, you kind of have like a grindy fourth line. You got JP Vijay with Jim Slater, and you also got head coach of the Columbus Blue Jackets, Brad Larson. On the defensive front, you got Greg DeVries and Alexei Zhitnik, Nicholas Havlid and Garnet Exelby, and then Andy Sutton and Shane Knighty. So pretty defensive and physically minded defensive core for the most part. Like I believe Zhitnik, threw a decent amount of hits, block shot. Same goes for guys like DeVries, Exelby, Sutton, and Knighty. Havlid was a really good shot blocker, and I could honestly give him probably gold ice pack, but I haven't done that yet. But maybe I will do that before this roster build comes out. Then in terms of their goaltending, they have a young Kari Yeletanen, who is only 23 years of age, and Johan Hedberg as the backup. And in depth-wise, they do have one forward, that being Steve Ruchin, who only played like half the season because I think he was injured, and this is his last season of his career. He only played in 47 games, but he did have 21 points over that span, so he was a pretty solid player, and he was really good when he was in Anaheim as well. Now, for players I had to cut from this Atlanta Thrashers team, I had to cut Eric Bolton and Steve McCarthy only, so those guys are not really anybody huge, but Eric Bolton played in 45 games, and Steve McCarthy played in 46, but I had to cut them due to the 600 skater limit. Now we get into the Boston Bruins, who are a pretty interesting team. They weren't that good this season. This was one of their worst years in recent memory. They finished the season 35, 41, and 6, so they were not that great at all. But they finished 23rd best in the entire league, so they weren't at the bottom, but they were still not a great team. So first line wise, you got Marco Sturm, who came over from San Jose in the Joe Thornton trade. Obviously, you got Mark Savard, who came over via free agency, I think, from Atlanta. And then you have a guy that was with the Bruins for quite a bit, and that is Glenn Murray. Second line wise, you got Phil Kessel in his first season. He's 19 years of age. I gave him some good shooting categories, and I gave him elite potential, which might be a bit too high up for him. But still, he should become a very good goal scorer for the Boston Bruins. And then you also have 21-year-old Patrice Bergeron at center, which is really nice. A very good piece for this team. And you also have a good defensive forward in PJ Axelson. Third line wise, you got Brandon Bochenski, who came over from Chicago with Mark Mowers, and Chuck Hobasu, who came over from Calgary. And fourth line wise, you got Peter Tenkrat, who I believe was playing his first season in the NHL in a long time, because he used to play for like the Ducks for like a little bit, I think it was, or Nashville or something like that, but this was his first season in the NHL back in quite a while, and then he would go back, I think, to the Czech Republic. You also got Sean Donovan and Stanislav Chistov, who came over from Anaheim. On the defensive front, you got a decent defensive core for the most part. You got Zdeno Chara in his first season in Boston, coming from Ottawa, obviously, in free agency, signing a big deal too. I'm pretty sure he's like signed to like 8-year deal or something in this. I'm not even sure exactly. And then Dennis Weidman, who came over from St. Louis in a trade that involved sending Brad Boyes the opposite direction. They also have Aaron Ward and Andrew Ference. Aaron Ward coming over from the Rangers in the Paul Mara deal, and Andrew Ference coming over from Calgary. Then on the top six, you have Andrew Alberts and Jason York, who actually didn't play in the NHL prior to the season. Like he in 05-06, he was over in Switzerland, I think it was, but before that, in like the 90s and stuff like that, he was playing with like Ottawa and Anaheim and stuff like that. Then in terms of goaltending, you got Tim Thomas, who's got some good X factors. The reason being why he's only an 83 is because he wasn't super good this season yet, but he will be a good goalie at some point. Like during this year, he went 30, 29, and 4 with a 3.13 goals against and a 905 save percentage, so he wasn't his spectacular self that he was in the 2011 Cup win, but those X factors should get him to simulate pretty good and maybe become that elite goalie he was at one point. And then his backup is Hannu Toivonen, and there is no depth guys for the Bruins, but I had to cut quite a bit of players from their roster, but a lot of them are lesser known guys like Jeremy Reich, Jan Stastny, for example. Jeff Hogan was cut from this build, but Jeff Hogan will be in the pre-deadline rosters, but not in this post-deadline roster. Bobby Allen was also cut. Mark Stewart was cut. That's probably the biggest one of the bunch. Also Nathan Dempsey and Matt Lashoff. Now we get into the Buffalo Sabres, who are obviously a very good team during this point in time, going to the conference finals, and obviously after losing to Ottawa, they kind of have fallen apart since, and they haven't really been that same team since these days. But this team went 53-22-7 and finished first in the entire NHL. They were just really good at scoring and very good defensively to an extent too. But yeah, top line wise, you got Jochen Hecht with Daniel Briere and Jason Pominville. Very good first line. Second line is also really good. You got Thomas Vanek, Derek Roy, and Maxim Afanaganov. Third line, you got Dinas Zubris, who came over from Washington. You also got Chris Drury and Alex Kolik. So you can see the center depth on this team is very, very good. And then fourth line wise, you got a kind of a grindy line. You got Andrew Peters, who's an enforcer, with Paul Gostad, who's a very good face-off man, but also can throw his weight around because he's a pretty big guy, and Adam Mayer. Then on the defensive front, you got Tony Lidman and Brian Campbell, Teppo Numanen and Dmitry Kalinin, and then Nathan Page, who was kind of like a fringe NHL defenseman for most of his career, and Yaroslav Spacek, so a pretty good defensive core. And then obviously they have a very good goaltender in Ryan Miller, who's 26 years of age, 90 overall. I gave him high starter potential, but he could honestly be an elite goalie at this rate, but I didn't make him that. I might change that, who knows. And then the backup is Ty Conklin, who went to the Cup Finals the year prior to this with Edmonton. And then in terms of depth, they have Tim Connolly, who is scratched, and the reason why he is scratched, you might be like, why is he scratched and he's an 85? Well, he only played in 2 games this season because of injury. And obviously, if he is in the lineup, you have a very, very good center depth because obviously Paul Gostad is a good faceoff man for 79, but pretty much all those other centers are 85 plus overall, which is really, really good. So this team would be even more filthy if they put him in and then took like Andrew Peters out, for example. So, but yeah, that's why Tim Connolly is scratched. Now for notable players I got rid of, or players I couldn't make because of the constraints, I got rid of Michael Ryan. Clark MacArthur wasn't able to be added. Either was Daniel Pye. That's probably one of the biggest ones. And same with Drew Stafford, Patrick Coletta, and Henrik Tallinger. So some pretty big names that I had to cut for Buffalo. But it is what it is. If EA could ever up the limit of created skaters, I will create more. But at the moment, I could only make so much. Now we get into the Calgary Flames, and this is also a pretty interesting team. So the first line is comprised of Tanguay, Langkow, and Jerome McGinley, who was recently inducted into the Hall of Fame. So a pretty damn good first line. Second line is also really good. You got Christian Huselius, Craig Conroy, who, as I mentioned, came over from the Los Angeles Kings. You also have Tony Amonte in his last season in his career, I'm pretty sure. Third line-wise, you got Marcus Nilsson, Matthew Lombardi, and Stefan Yell. And then fourth line-wise, you got Wayne Primo, Byron Ritchie, and Jeff Friesen, who I think also was in his last season, just like Tony Amonte was. On the defensive end, you have an 87-year-old, not 87-year-old, oh man, 87 overall, 21-year-old Dion Phaneuf. Dion Phaneuf was incredible this season and in 05-06 in his rookie year. This year, he scored 17 goals and had 33 assists for 50 points. So he definitely is warranted of being a high overall, but I think basically when he went to Toronto, that kind of ruined his career a bit, but he was actually really good in his early years in Calgary. I just don't know why Calgary didn't keep him around, but they got rid of him. They also have Roman Hamrlik, who's a former first overall pick. You got Brad Stewart and Robin Regier. And on the top 6, you got Andre Zuzin and Rhett Warner. In terms of goaltending, you got Mika Kiprasov, obviously, who's a very good goalie, 30 years of age, medium elite, 90 overall, and his backup in Jamie McLennan. And in terms of depth, you got Mark Giordano, who actually went over to Russia the year after this because of a contract dispute, I think it was, but he came back in 08-09, obviously, and he is a future captain of the Calgary Flames, but he's got high top 4 potential at 23, and he's a 79 overall, so I don't know how good he's going to develop, but I don't really see Giordano as an elite defenseman until his later days when he was like 30-something years old, so it's really hard to kind of rate him. But that's what I put it at because the fact he wasn't in the NHL the year afterwards. Now for notable players I had to get rid of for Calgary, I had to get rid of Dustin Boyd, Brandon Prust, which really doesn't matter because Brandon Prust is a prick, but who cares about that. David Moss also had to get rid of. Darren McCarty couldn't make it, Eric Goddard couldn't make it, and same with David Hale. So a bunch of physical players I had to cut from the Calgary Flames, but it is what it is. We make our way to the Carolina Hurricanes coming off a Stanley Cup win, and they have a pretty interesting roster. So they have Ray Whitney, Rod Brindamore, the captain of the team, and a very good face-off man, one of the best in the league nonetheless. and Justin Williams, who obviously was a very good playoff player, and I wish there was an X factor for playoff performances because I would give it to him, but obviously I couldn't because there's nothing there, so I had to just give him these just in case to kind of get him to perform a little bit better, because realistically he wasn't a huge performer in the regular season. Like, he was good, but he wasn't like super good. Like, he had 67 points this year, but most of his career he wasn't putting up 67 plus points. So second line wise, you got Scott Walker. You also got Eric Stahl in his third season in the NHL at 22 years of age, and you got Eric Cole. Third line wise, you got Andrew Ladd in his second season with Joseph Vasicek, rest in peace, who just came over actually at the trade deadline from the Nashville Predators. Like, he was in Carolina the year before, signed in Nashville, and then got dealt back to Carolina, which is interesting. And then a year after this, he'd be in the New York Islanders. But rest in peace to Joseph Vasicek, because he was one of those guys in Locomotive. We also got Anson Carter, who was with Columbus prior to this trade deadline. And then you also have Craig Adams, Trevor Letowski, and Chad LaRose. Onto the defensive core, I actually had to cut some pretty big defensemen from this core, which I'll mention in a bit. But we have Nicholas Wallin and Mike Commodore. Second pairing, you have David Tanabe and Glenn Wesley. And then this third pairing is comprised of Tim Gleason and Anton Babchuk. As for goaltending, you got Cam Ward and John Graham. And then depth-wise, you have Corey Stillman, who is scratched currently. The reason being is because Corey Stillman only laced up in 43 games this year. I don't know if it was because of injury or what, but he missed a lot of the season, so he is depth at the moment. Now, for notable players I had to cut, like I was mentioning, it's mostly defensemen, or actually it's all defensemen I had to cut, because there was a lot of defenders on this team that played a lot of games, but I went based on games played. So defensemen like Brett Hedican, Andrew Hutchinson, Francis Caberlet, and Dennis Seidenberg all got cut because of the amount of games they played. So the most notable ones would be like Brett Hedican, because obviously he was with them when they won the cup, and he played still like 57 games this year or something like that, or 50 games this year. But then guys like Andrew Hutchinson don't really matter that much, but Seidenberg and Caberlet are also two kind of big ones. Caberlet, I don't know why he missed a lot of games this season, if he was just a scratch, but he only played in 27 games, and Seidenberg was acquired via trade, but he only played in like 20 games with the Canes, so he was also taken out of this build. Now we get into the Chicago Blackhawks, who were not really that good of a team. They finished 26th in the league with a 31-42-9 record. On the first line, you got Tomo Rutu, who was a really good hitter. You got Michael Hanzus, who's kind of underrated to an extent, but he also missed a lot of the season, so I could technically make him scratch, but I didn't. I think he only played in 8 games, but he had 8 points during that span. And we also have Martin Havlat, who was also in his first season, I believe, with Chicago, because I think he was with Ottawa the year before. Second line-wise, you got Radim Verbata, Jason Williams, who came over from Detroit, and Patrick Sharp. Third line-wise, you got Renee Bork with Dennis Arkhipov and Martin Lapointe, and a fourth line comprised of Jeff Hamilton, Michael Holmquist, and Nikita Alexiev, who came over from the Tampa Bay Lightning. This was like one of the only seasons that Jeff Hamilton really played in the NHL, but he was actually not that bad of a player. 39 points in 70 games this year, so kind of an underrated player to an extent there. And in the defensive core, it's kind of interesting. You got a lot of good young talent here. You got Duncan Keith, who's only 23. You got James Wisniewski, who's only 22. And Brent Seabrook, who's only 21. But then you also got some kind of more grindy veteran defenders. You got Jim Vandermeer. You got Jason Cullimore, who's 34. And you also got Adrian Aucoin, who was the captain of this team at 33 years of age. Goalie-wise, you got Nikolai Hebibulin, who was 34 years of age and not as good as he was when he was with Tampa Bay, kind of dwindling in terms of how good of a goalie he was. And his backup is also another old goalie in Patrick Lalime, and there was no depth for this team. But for notable players I had to cut from this team, I had to cut Martin St. Pierre. I also had to cut Craig McDonald. Tony Salmelainen didn't make it. Peter Bondra didn't make it because Peter Bondra was signed late into the season, so he didn't end up playing that much. Also, Troy Brower was cut. Cam Barker was cut, which that's one's a big one. Danny Richmond. And also Dustin Byfuglien was cut because he only played in 9 games. Now we get into the Colorado Avalanche, who are kind of an interesting team because there's a lot of good young players on this team, but also some good veterans. So first line-wise, you got Andrew Brunette, who actually had a really good season this year. Like, I think this one was his best year. He was over point per game, going 83 points in 82 games, but it could be because he played with Joe Sakic. I'm not 100% sure of that because Sakic had 100 points this year, which is pretty good for how good this team is. And he also has Milan Hajduk on his wing. Second line wise, it's a young second line. You got Marek Svatos, who is 24 years of age. Rest in peace to him as well. You also have Paul Stastny, who is in his first NHL season and had a really good year this year with 78 points in 82 games. And I don't remember if he won the Calder, but it was one of his best seasons. I think this was his best season of his career so far. And you also have Wojtek Wolski, who came from Poland. But he had some good early years in his career, but he kind of fell off a cliff and ended up going overseas, I think, and retiring at a decently young age, I'm pretty sure. Third line-wise, you got Brad Richardson, who's also in one of his first seasons. I think this might actually be his first season, or unless he played a little bit in 05-06. But obviously, he still plays with the Calgary Flames. You also got Tyler Arneson and Ian Laperriere. Fourth line-wise, you got Mark Rycroft, who I believe does some sort of analyst stuff with Colorado now. I could be wrong with that. You also have Brett McLean and Antti Laaksonen. On the defensive front, you got Brett Clark and Ken Klee, Ozzy Vananen and Carlos Gracians. Rest in peace to Carlos. He's another one of those guys that were on that plane, I'm pretty sure. And you also have John Michael Lyles and Kurt Sauer. Now, you're probably wondering why John Michael Lyles is down there. It's because based on ice time, when I was looking on NHL.com, it said 5-on-5 wise, he didn't get a lot of ice time, but power play wise, he got a lot of ice time. So that's why he's on the third pairing. As for goalies, you have Peter Budaj and you also have Jose Theodore. I don't know if Jose Theodore was supposed to be the starter this year or what, but he might have missed some games maybe due to injury. I'm not 100% sure with that. But he only played 33 games this year, and Budaj played in 57, so that's why Budaj is the starter. And in depth-wise, you have Jordan Leopold, who didn't really play a lot of games this year as well. He played only in 15 games. Yeah, he only played 15 games, so he was injured a lot as well. But he is there as depth in case you want to put him into the lineup, which more likely you would instead of like Kurt Sauer, for example. Now, for notable players I had to cut from Colorado, with the big one being Pierre Turgeon, because Pierre Turgeon was in the last year of his NHL career. He only played in 17 games this regular season. I don't know if it was injury or because he was getting old because he was 37, but he was cut from this build, unfortunately, which is a big loss. Also, Ben Guite and Scott Parker, so some more grindy physical guys for the bottom six. Those guys were cut. And then two key defensemen were cut, including Patrice Brisebois, because Patrice Brisebois didn't play that much this season. He only played in 33 games, and Jeff Finger was also cut. Now we get into the Columbus Blue Jackets, who weren't a really good team either this year. They were 24th in the league. You got some really interesting players. You got Rick Nash, who's only 22 years of age. He's got low elite potential, so he might be better than he was in real life. I'm not 100% sure. You also got a veteran Sergei Fedorov, who was 37 years old. Kind of weird seeing him in Columbus, but he was there for a couple of years. And you also have David Viborny. Second line-wise, you got Nikolai Zherdev with Dan Fritchie, who is actually from Ohio, which is kind of neat, and Frederick Modine. Third line-wise, you got Jason Chimera, Manny Malhotra, who was an incredible face-off man. I believe he was 58% on the draw in his career or something like that, which is ridiculous. And you also have Alexander Svitov, who was a high-up pick, but he was not a good pick at all by Tampa Bay in the earlier 2000s. Fourth line-wise, you got kind of a grindy line. You got Jeff Platt, who really didn't play that long in the NHL, more notably known as a good KHL player, I'm pretty sure. You also got Gilbert Brulé at 20 years of age. And you also got Jody Shelley, who is an enforcer and a very good analyst, actually, for Fox Sports Ohio. I actually really like his commentary, him and Jeff Rimmer. They're pretty awesome. And then on defense, you got Rostislav Klesla and Adam Foote. And you also got Ron Hainsey, who's pretty good. But then it kind of trails off a bit. You got Anders Eriksson. You got Ole Christian Tollefson, who was pretty physical, got in quite a few fights for his limited NHL action. And also Aaron Johnson. So yeah, that defensive core is probably what it's going to drag down the team a bit. And then also the depth for sure. Goaltending-wise, you got Frederic Norena and Pascal Leclerc, who Pascal Leclerc was regarded as going to be a really good goalie, but unfortunately for him, he suffered a lot of injuries in his career, so that kind of derailed his chances to becoming a very good goalie. And then in terms of depth, you have one goaltender, and that came over from the Chicago Blackhawks, that being Brian Boucher. So I think Brian Boucher only played a couple of games because of the fact that Pascal Leclerc was out with injury. So Boucher got to play 3 games with the Blue Jackets that season. Now for notable players I had to cut from the Blue Jackets, I had to cut Alexander Picard as in the forward. He only played in 23 games, so it didn't really matter that much. I also had to cut Duvie Westcott, and most notably I had to cut Mark Methot because Mark Methot was in his first season and only played in 20 games this year. Now we get into the Dallas Stars, who hosted the All-Star game this year. So first line-wise, we got Brendan Morrow, who was pretty much an all-around player. Guy could throw his weight around, He could also put up points though too, so he was a really good player. As so, he was the captain of this team. You also got the alternate captain in Mike Modano beside him, and also Yuri Letnin, who was a very good two-way forward, and yeah, he was very good defensively. Second line wise, you got Eric Lindros, which is kind of weird to see him in Dallas because he was only there for a little bit. This year prior, he was in Toronto. Like, after the lockout, Eric Lindros really didn't play that much, and he played with some weird teams, so it's kind of interesting to see that. You also have Mike Ribeiro, who I believe led this team in points this year, and he was really good. This was, I think, his first season in Dallas, coming over from Montreal. You also have Ladislav Nagy, who was acquired from Dallas, or by Dallas from Arizona or Phoenix at this point in time. Third line wise, you got Louis Eriksson with Stu Barnes, very good veteran, and Jussi Jokinen, who was a very good player in shootouts. He obviously pulled off like the Sweet Sweden 94 a couple times in shootouts before in his career, and yeah, he was pretty good. And then on to the fourth line, you got Antti Miettinen, Jeff Halpern being the center. He's actually from, I believe, like Washington, D.C., and he actually played for Washington for a bit. He might actually be from Maryland, but somewhere around that area. And then you also have Nicholas Hagman. Then onto the defensive core, you have a good veteran defensive core, but it's also a very good defensive core. You have Matthias Nordstrom, who came over from Los Angeles for like Yaroslav Modry. Both the two of those guys actually were teammates in LA, which is kind of neat. And you also have Sergei Zubov, who obviously is in the Hall of Fame now, and one of the most underrated defensemen, I think, of all time. Second pairing wise, you got Philippe Boucher. You also got Trevor Daley at 23 years of age, which is pretty nice. And on the top six, you got Daryl Sador, who's a good veteran, and Stefan Rowita. As for goaltenders, you got Marty Turco, who is obviously a very good goalie. This season, he had like a 2.23 goals against average and a 910 save percentage, which is ridiculous. And also, we have Mike Smith, who was in one of his first seasons, and he was also really good this year because this team was so good defensively. He went 12-5-2 with a 223 goals against average, just like Turco, and a 912 save percentage. And I decided to give him adventure just because in real life right now, Mike Smith is a very good goalie to like pass the puck around and shoot for empty nets and all that type of thing. So, and then they don't have any depth because of the constraints. But guys, I had to cut from this. Unfortunately, I had to cut Patrick Stefan, even though he did miss the empty net this season. I had to cut him because he only played in 41 games because I'm pretty sure he got injured after he missed that empty net, and then he pretty much never played again almost after that. So he was cut from this build. I also had to cut Henrik Lundqvist's brother Joel, unfortunately, because of constraints. I had to cut Steve Vaught, which is kind of one of the biggest ones. Also, Matthew Barnaby was cut, Chris Barch, Chris Connor, and then two defensemen in John Clem and Nolan Baumgartner. Now we'll get into Detroit because we'll leave the All-Star teams for last because the All-Star teams we could just kind of skim over. So this Detroit team was really good. Obviously, they made it to the conference finals and then they won the Cup the year afterwards and went to the Cup finals the year after that, but lost to Pittsburgh. So this team was really stacked. You got Pavel Datsyuk, Henrik Zetterberg, and Johan Franzen. Very good first line, obviously. And then second line wise, you got Kyle Calder, who I think came over from like Philadelphia at the deadline. You also have Robert Lang and Mikhail Samuelson. Third line wise, you got Dane Cleary, Chris Draper, who obviously is a very good defensive forward, also very good face-off winning percentage, and Thomas Holmstrom, who I honestly should give gold solar eclipse to, but I gave him silver because this guy was always in front of the net, so he was a very kind of guy that could get in the way and play physically and all that type of thing. Fourth line wise, you got Kirk Maltby, Valtteri Filppula, and Yuri Hudler, so a little bit of a younger fourth line with a good veteran in Kirk Maltby. Maltby and Draper were really good on the penalty kill throughout their entire careers together, and always when I think of one, I think of the other. It's just that synonymous with the two of them. Then on the defensive core, you got a really good defensive core with Lidstrom and Schneider. That is the top two pairing. Lidstrom being one of the best defensemen in this build. I think he actually is the best overall defenseman in this build because he had some really good seasons around this point in time and won a lot of Norris trophies. Second pairing wise, we have Nicholas Kronwall, who could throw some big hits, and Danny Markov in his last NHL season. And then on the top six, you have Chris Chelios at 45 years of age, which is ridiculous to say. That's why he's down to an 83, but he still has that elite potential. But he probably would retire pretty early into franchise mode. I don't see him playing till his actual age in real life, but you never know, he might stick around. You also have Brett Lebda as his pairing. Then in terms of goaltenders, you have some really good goaltending combinations. You got Dominik Hasek being one of the best goalies of all time. maybe even the best goalie of all time. I'm not going to say my opinions on that. And Chris Osgood is the backup, who also was one of the best goalies of all time to an extent, but nobody really talks about him, which is kind of annoying because he actually was a really underrated goalie. And then in terms of depth, we have one player, and that is Todd Bertuzzi. Todd Bertuzzi came over from Florida and didn't really play that much with Detroit this season. He only played in 8 games during the regular season. I don't know if he got injured as well after he came over from Florida, but he didn't play a lot this year. And then eventually he'd go on to like Anaheim in the offseason, but he is scratched. But yeah, he's an 85 overall. In terms of notable players I had to cut from the Detroit Red Wings, I had to cut Matt Ellis. I also had to cut Josh Langfeld, Thomas Kopecky, and Andreas Lilia. So Lilia is probably like the biggest of the bunch. Then we get into the Edmonton Oilers, who obviously went to the Stanley Cup final the year before this. This team is kind of a weird looking team because they did have to trade away Ryan Smith at the trade deadline. As well as a couple other players they traded away throughout the season. But first line-wise, you got Joffrey Lupul, Sean Horkoff, and Alex Hemsky. Obviously, Hemsky scoring that goal on that Patrick Stefan bluff that happened. Second line-wise, you got Peter Sikora, which is still kind of weird seeing him in Edmonton because he was only there for a little bit. You also got Jared Stoll and Rafi Torres, who could definitely throw his weight around and play on the edge. Third line-wise, Ethan Moreau, who actually didn't play a lot this season because of injuries. He only played in 7 games, but I did put him in the lineup. You also have Peter Nedved, who came over from Philadelphia, and Fernando Pisani, who was like the playoff hero in their 05-06 run. Fourth line rise, you got Patrick Thornton, who I believe is from Norway. You got Marty Reisner and Toby Peterson, who was playing his first few NHL games since like a long time before this. Like I believe he hadn't played since 2001. He was playing more in the AHL, so he's not really that great of a player. But he got to play in the lineup this year for 64 games. Then on to the defensive core, you got Jan Heda in his first season, and then I believe he went on to Columbus after this. You also got Jason Smith, who was the captain of this team. Second pairing-wise, you got Steve Stais with Ladislav Smid, who I think was in his first year. And you also got Daniel Charnquist and Matt Green, who could definitely throw a lot of hits. Goalie-wise, you got Dwayne Rolson and Jussi Markkanen, so a pretty good goaltending tandem. And in depth-wise, you don't got anybody. Now, for players I had to cut from Edmonton, I had to cut Marc-Antoine Pouliot. I had to cut Brad Winchester, J.F. Jacques. I also had to cut Zach Sortini, so some physical bottom 6 players mostly. And then I also had to cut a lot of defensemen because they went through a lot of defensemen this year, including Matthew Waugh, Danny Savret, Brian Young, and Tom Gilbert. Now we get into the Europe United, who, as I was mentioning, replaces Vegas, and they also are comprised of former players that played in like the SHL and future players that also played like in the SHL, the SM Liga, Russia, that type of thing. So first line wise, you got Jan Lavic with Robert Reichel and Alexei Morozov. Morozov playing with Pittsburgh in his career, Robert Reichel playing with guys like Toronto, Calgary, the Islanders, that type of team, but he was really good in his prime. And Jan Lavic playing with like Carolina, Tampa Bay, the New York Rangers, that type of team. But he actually went to Tampa Bay in 2007-08. Like, he went overseas and then he came back to the NHL for one season where he played with Tampa Bay and the Nashville Predators, but then he went back to Czech Republic after that. Second line-wise, you got Oleg Kavasha, Joseph Baranek, who played a lot in the 90s, and Nicholas Sundstrom, who I believe played the year before this for the Montreal Canadiens. Third line-wise has Andrei Kovalenko with some good young guys in Nicholas Backstrom, who's got elite potential, that being the one that's in Washington right now and not the goaltender. And you also have Nikolai Kuhlman, who obviously played for the Leafs and the Islanders. Fourth line-wise, you got Sean Bergenheim, who obviously played with the New York Islanders prior to this, but then he played 1 year overseas, it seems like, and then he came back to the Islanders and stuff like that, so that's why he's on this team. You also have Vladimir Sabatka, who is a former or future NHLer, playing for Boston and St. Louis, most notably, also Buffalo a bit. And I also decided to add Alexei Cherepanov, rest in peace to this guy, because this guy tragically passed away when he was like only 19 or 20 years old. Like, his heart stopped working when he was on the bench. A lot of you guys might remember that. A lot of you guys might be too young to know that, but yeah, this guy was supposed to be really good, I'm pretty sure, because I believe he was a high up first rounder. So I gave him top 6 potential, 75 overall, and I also gave him some X factors, so hopefully he could become a good goal scorer in this franchise mode type of thing when I do a franchise mode. But it really sucks that he passed away so young, because he definitely had a good career ahead of him if he would have made it to the NHL. Even if he didn't make it to the NHL, he probably would have had a good KHL career, I would assume. Then on to the defensive core, you got Yuri Slager, who is a good veteran that played a lot in the 90s, as well as Alexander Karpatsev, who's another one of those guys that passed away on that Yaroslavl Lokomotiv plane. Rest in peace to him as well. Second pairing wise, you got Igor Ulanov and Jason Woolley, and top six wise, you got some prospect kind of defensemen in Nicholas Chalmerson, who obviously played with Chicago in Arizona that blocked a lot of shots, and Anton Strawman, so kind of more defensive minded defenders, but still some good potential there. And then goaltending wise, you got Roman Turek, who was a really good goalie when he played with like Dallas, St. Louis, I believe, for a bit, and Calgary. And then obviously he went to Czech Republic to live out the rest of his career with his home country. As his backup, you have Antti Niemi, who didn't play in the NHL until he went to the Cup Finals in like 2010. But he's there. He's got some potential, so I don't know if he'll develop, but hopefully he does. And then depth-wise, there is nobody on this team. But I did have to cut a couple players that I was potentially going to make for this team, including Alexander Korolyuk, who's a former San Jose Sharks player, and Carl Gunnarsson, who you guys would know that played with Toronto and St. Louis and won a Stanley Cup actually with St. Louis recently, and I think retired just in the offseason if I'm not mistaken. Now we get into the Florida Panthers, who were kind of an interesting team this year. They finished 21st in the league. First line wise, we got Martin Jelena with Olli Jokinen, who was really good during this time period. Phenomenally good. He had 91 points in 82 games this season, and I believe the year before and the year afterwards, he was like over point per game. So this was like peak Olli Jokinen time period. You also have Nathan Horton on his wing. Second line wise, you got Rostislav Oles in his second season, Josef Stumpel, and Ville Peltonen, who I believe returned to the NHL this season because he was originally a San Jose Sharks prospect and played with them a little bit in the 90s. Third line wise, you got Chris Gratton with Steven Weiss and Juraj Kolnick. And fourth line wise, you got David Booth in his first season with Gregory Campbell. And Joe Nieuwendyk is down here on the fourth line because this was the last year of his career. But he was still pretty good. He had 8 points in his 15 games he played in the NHL this year. On the defensive front, you got Ruslan Saleh, another one of those guys that passed away in that 2011 plane crash. Rest in peace to him. You also got Jay Bouwmeester pretty early into his career, I believe in his third season. Or maybe fourth season. Yeah, I think it might be his fourth season. Not 100% sure. He might have started in 2002-03. So yeah, it's probably 4 years. Second pairing, you got Mike Van Ryn and Brian Allen, who was part of that Luongo trade that happened around this time period, a little bit earlier than this, like 05-06, I think. You also have Branislav Meze and Steve Montstor, who's another guy that passed away recently, like a couple years ago, or maybe like 5 years ago now at this point. But yeah, rest in peace to Steve as well. It sucks to see a lot of these guys pass away already. So, and then their goaltending tandem is Ed Belfour in his last NHL season, and Alex Auld, who was also part of the Roberto Luongo trade that sent Luongo to the Canucks. And in depth-wise, they do not have anybody, but they do have a lot of players I had to cut because they kind of went through a lot of roster players this year. So I had to cut like Rob Globke, Drew Larman, Giannis Sprooks, Camille Krebs, Anthony Stewart, who obviously does stuff on Sportsnet now, and Alexei Semenov and Noah Welsh. So a lot of fringe NHLers, so those guys don't matter too much. Then we make our way over to an interesting team in the Los Angeles Kings, who were terrible this season. They finished 28th in the NHL with only 27 wins in those 82 games they played. But they do have some good upside for the future for sure. They have Mike Camilleri, who's only 24 at an 86 overall. He's a really good player at this time period. He actually had 80 points in 81 games. You also have a young Anze Kopitar who's only 19 years of age. He's got that elite potential, and he's going to become a very good defensive forward for you if you decide to play as the Los Angeles Kings in a franchise mode. He's a really good player, obviously. And then you also have Alexander Frolov, who's only 24 and top 6 potential. So a very good first line for future development and whatnot. Second line also has some good young guys. You have Patrick O'Sullivan playing with a veteran in Derek Armstrong, and another young guy in 22-year-old Dustin Brown, who obviously could throw his weight around and throw a lot of hits. So you definitely got some good young talent in your top 6. As for the third line, you got Scott Thornton with Jamie Lundmark, who I believe came over in that Craig Conroy deal I was mentioning earlier, and Brian Wilsey. And then the fourth line is pretty weak. You got John Zeiler, who really didn't play a whole lot in the NHL over his career, but he was thrown into the lineup because of all the trades that the Kings made this season. He only played in like 23 games this year, and I believe he played less than 100 NHL games. And then you also have Tom Kostopoulos and Raitis Ivanons, who is a Latvian enforcer playing on that fourth line. Then onto the defensive core, you got some pretty solid defensemen. You got Lubomir Wisnowski, who was probably one of the most underrated defensemen, I would say, in this time period. He had 58 points in 69 games this year, and I believe he also made the All-Star game, if I'm not mistaken, so he's a pretty good defender. And you also got Rob Blake, who made his return to the Los Angeles Kings I believe in 05-06, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe it was this season. But previously, he was obviously in Colorado, and he would go to San Jose in, I think, 07-08. Then on to the second pairing, you have Aaron Miller, who's a good veteran, and Yaroslav Modry, who I was mentioning, came over for his former teammate in Matty Nordstrom. And then on the top six, you got Kevin Dahlman, who was kind of a fringe NHL defenseman, and Jamie Heward, who came over from Washington, I believe, since the beginning of the season. As for goaltending, you got two French goalies in Mathieu Guérin and Dan Cloutier. And then Dan Cloutier's health was kind of dwindling at this point, so he really didn't play that much games, and he got injured quite a bit. That's why his durability is down to a 70. And then in terms of depth, you got some more goaltenders, and you also have more in their AHL system, which I'll show you guys when we get to that point. But Sean Burke was there at the end of his career, and Barry Brust, who was more of an AHL goalie for his entire career. Notable players I had to cut from this team include Marty Murray, Alan McCauley, Noah Clark, and then some defensemen like Mike Weaver. Oleg Tverdovsky was a pretty big one, and Peter Harold. Then we get into the Minnesota Wild, and this is a pretty interesting team as well. They actually played really good this season, very good defensive team, and yeah, pretty much that's that. So first line has Pavel Demitra, rest in peace to him as well, being another one of those Yaroslav Lokomotiv players. Mikko Koivu, whose jersey number recently got retired, which is pretty neat to see, considering this is technically, I think, one of his first full seasons in the NHL at this point. So he's their top line center. And you also have Marian Gaborik, who really didn't play a whole lot this season because of an injury, I think. He played in 48 games, but he had 57 points and 30 goals. So this guy was a machine, and I could honestly make him a higher overall if I wanted to. But if he would have played a full season in the NHL this year, he could have had a 50 goal a year, no question about that. This is a really nice season for him, even though his injury happened. I would assume it was an injury, at least if he only played in 48 games, because you're not going to scratch Marian Gaborik for 30-something games, right? So second line-wise, you got Pierre-Marc Bouchard, who I gave Spinorama just because of his shootout goal for the memes, why not? You also have Wes Walls, who's a good veteran, and Brian Rolston, who had a good slap shot. He used it a lot on shootout attempts, which is kind of different, but yeah, he's there. Third line-wise, you got Branko Radivojevic with Todd White and Mark Parrish. And a fourth line is a kind of a grindy defensive fourth line. You got Stefan Veilleux. You also got Dominic Moore and Adam Hall. Dominic Moore would be with the Penguins, I believe, in the pre-deadline rosters, if I'm not mistaken. As for defense, you got Martin Skula and Kim Janssen. A young Brent Burns at 21 years of age. Should be interesting to see how he develops. You also have Nick Schultz, who's only 24. A veteran defenseman that's pretty good defensively in Keith Carney with Curtis Foster. As for goaltenders, you got a very good goaltending combination. You got Manny Fernandez and Nicholas Backstrom. Both these goalies were really good this season, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, they won the Jennings. Backstrom had a fantastic rookie season because this was his rookie year. He went 23-8-6 with a 1.97 goals against average and a 929 save percentage with 5 shutouts. I don't know if it was just the team was that good defensively or he was just that good, but he was really good. And Manny Fernandez had a really good season as well with a 255 goals against and a 911 save percentage. So some very good goaltending from this team. And their only depth option is Wyatt Smith. And then for players that I had to cut from this team, I had to cut a couple that I didn't really want to, including Derek Bugard. Rest in peace to him. I had to cut him because he didn't play enough games. I would have added him instead of Wyatt Smith, but Wyatt Smith played a lot more games. Matthias Weinhandel was also cut, so that kind of sucks. Joel Ward, because Joel Ward was with Minnesota at one point. And I also had to cut Petteri Nummelin, which kind of sucks because he also played a decent amount of games this season. Now we get our way into the Montreal Canadiens, and this is kind of an interesting roster as well. This team was kind of 500 during the season, so they weren't really a fantastic team, but they weren't a terrible team. So first line-wise, you got Chris Higgins with Saku Koivu and Alex Kovalev. So Kovalev and Koivu obviously being really good. And yeah, Koivu's got that born leader thing, so when he scores, it should help out the team a little bit. And Kovalev is also up there. Higgins is just a good takeaway player. Second line-wise, you got Sergei Samsonov with Radek Bonk and Mike Johnson, who does stuff on TSN now. Third line has Michael Ryder, Thomas Plekanec in one of his first few seasons, and Guillaume Latendresse is also there. Before, obviously, he would kind of he'd retire pretty young because of injury problems, I think, but I gave him top 9 potential, so he might end up becoming something, I don't know. Fourth line-wise, you kind of a grindy line. You got Garth Murray, who's more of an enforcer than anything. Didn't really put up any points in his career. You got Steve Bégin, who's kind of a grinder. or a defensive forward, one of the two, or both. And then you also have Alexander Perezhogin, who didn't really have a long NHL career because he would eventually go to like the KHL. On the defensive front, you got Andrei Markov, you also got Mike Komisarek, you got Sheldon Souray, who had an incredible season this year. He scored 26 goals, and he had 64 points, but he was a minus 28. And then he would get a huge contract in Edmonton, I'm pretty sure, this offseason. And obviously, he didn't really live up to the hype in Edmonton by comparison. But 26 goals this year is nuts. You don't really see a lot of defensemen scoring 20-plus goals, but there was a couple during this time period. And his defense partner, you got Francis Bouillon. Top 6-wise, you got Mark Streit and Matthew Dandino, who also played forward at one point when he was with Detroit. Goaltending-wise, you got Cristobal Huet, who made the All-Star game this year. He's from France. You also got David Abisher, who's from Switzerland as a backup, so kind of an interesting combination there. And the depth goaltender is Yaroslav Halak, because Yaroslav Halak played in 16 games this season, so that's why I have him as a depth option and not in the AHL. But there is a Habs goaltender in the AHL, just in case you wanted to know, and you probably know who it is. Just me mentioning that. For notable players I had to get rid of because of the constraints, we had to cut Maxime Lapierre, which kind of sucks. We also had to cut Andre Kostitsyn. We had to cut Aaron Downey, Josh Georges because he didn't really play that much this season, and Yanni Niedemo, which was one that played a decent amount of games. Now into the Nashville Predators, who are kind of an interesting team because they did make some pretty big moves this deadline. So first line wise, you got Paul Kariya with Peter Forsberg and Steve Sullivan. Kind of a weird line to see in Nashville because Kariya wasn't there that long. Forsberg was acquired at the deadline, I think, or a little bit before the deadline from Philadelphia. So if you guys play with the pre-deadline rosters, Forsberg will be in Philadelphia and not in Nashville, but they'll still be a pretty good team. And then there's Steve Sullivan, who was really good, but I also missed time because his injury problems were starting to add up around this point in time. Second line-wise, you got J.P. Dumont with David Legwand and Martin Erat. Third line, Scott Hartnell, Jason Arnott, and Alexander Radulov. So that center depth is really good right now. But obviously, once you get rid of Forsberg, if you're doing the pre-deadline rosters, it'll be a little bit weaker, but it's still pretty good. And then fourth line-wise, you have Jordan Tutu, who's a good grindy guy with Jared Smithson and Vernon Fiddler. On the defensive front, you got Dan Hamhuis and Shea Weber. This defensive core is actually pretty gross as well because it's always pretty gross in Nashville. Like, they've always just had a really good defensive build around their team. So yeah, Weber and Hamhuis. Second pairing, you got Ryan Suter in his second season with Merit Zadlichki. And then top 6-wise, you got Kimmo Timonen playing down there. The reason being is, once again, he's kind of similar to like a John Michael Lyles, where he played on the power play, but also played top 6 minutes. And he's also playing with Greg Zanin. Goalie-wise, you got Thomas Vokoun and Chris Mason, so a pretty good goalie combination. And in depth-wise, you got Vitaly Vishnevsky, who I believe came over from the Atlanta Thrashers close to the deadline. He's more of just like a top 6/depth defenseman at best. Now, for guys I had to cut for Nashville, there were some pretty big ones. I had to cut Scott Nickel, unfortunately. He played in 59 games this year. I also had to cut Rich Peverly, who barely played actually with Nashville, but still a key piece to other teams in the future. I also had to cut Darcy Hordachuk, Ramsey Abid, and that was it for the Predators. Now we make our way over to the New Jersey Devils, who went to the second round of the playoffs before my Sens decided to eliminate them, which was really good. First line-wise, we got Jay Pandolfo, very good defensive forward. Also a guy that didn't really take a lot of penalty minutes, which is really good. You have Scott Gomez in his last season in New Jersey before he would sign a pretty good contract with the Rangers in the offseason, I'm pretty sure. And we also have Patrick Elias. Second line-wise, you got Jamie Langenbrunner, who scored an OT winner against my Sens in that playoff round against a playoff win against my Sens. I believe that was the only win they got of the series, though, because the Sens won all those rounds in like 5 games. So, and you also have a young Travis Zajac, who was in his first NHL season. You also have a young Zach Parise, who's only 22 years of age and in his second season in the NHL. He had a pretty good year this year with 31 goals and 62 points. Third line-wise, you got Sergei Brylin, John Madden, and Brian Gionta. Brian Gionta being a small, fast guy. I don't know if I got his height accurate because of the fact you can't make players less than 5'7". It might be accurate, it might not be, but there's players that for some reason are like shorter than 5'7", like Theo Fleury, for example, that I can't make 5'6", so it really sucks. Fourth line wise, you got Eric Rasmussen, Jim Dowd, and Mike Rupp, so more of a grindy hitting fourth line. Defensively, you got Paul Martin, and no, not the former Prime Minister of Canada. You also got Brian Rafalski, who's a pretty underrated defenseman, I'd say, because he had more playoff points in less playoff games than somebody like Scott Niedermayer. So I'd say Rafalski is almost one of the most underrated defensemen of this era. of hockey. Second pairing wise, you got Brad Lukowich and Colin White. And top six wise, you got Johnny Oduya with Andy Green. So the defensive core is not as good as it was, obviously, way back when New Jersey won a lot of cups with like Scott Stevens, Scott Niedermayer, that type of thing. So it kind of dwindled, but it was still a pretty good defensive core. And then obviously still having goaltender Martin Brodeur in between the pipes. That helped out a lot in terms of defense. Martin Brodeur is tied for the best goaltender in this build. Not a surprise, though, at a 92 overall. And the backup goaltender is Scott Clemenson. As for depth, they only have one guy, and that's a grindy forward, and that's Cam Jansen, kind of like an enforcer, grinder. I don't think he really put up much points, but he fought a lot of players. And for players I had to cut from this team, I had to cut Alex Brooks, Jim Fahey, and most notably, I had to cut Richard Matvichuk. Now, Matvichuk's kind of an interesting one. He only played in one game during the regular season, so I don't know if he got injured, but he really didn't play at all that year. But he did come in the playoffs and play, I believe, the entire time with them in the playoffs. So I didn't make him, but if you wanted to make a player, I would say to make somebody like him, and then you could replace like Andy Green, for example. But yeah, that's basically that. Okay, on to the roster for the New York Islanders. So starting off with on the left side, we have Ryan Smith, who, as I was mentioning, came over from the Edmonton Oilers around the trade deadline. He's a pretty big acquisition for this team, but he didn't spend too long with New York, obviously, because he would go to like Colorado the season after this, and then I think also to LA a few years after that. So he was there. You also have Mike Sillinger, the father of Cole Sillinger, and Miroslav Shatan. Second line wise, you got Victor Kozlov, Randy Robitaille, and Jason Blake. So pretty good second line there. Jason Blake actually had 40 goals this year, so that was the season that made the Toronto Maple Leafs think he was going to be a good player, and then he didn't end up becoming that for them. Third line wise, we have Andy Hilbert with Alexei Yashin. Now you could move Yashin up and down in the lineup. What I've heard is later in the season he was not producing that well, so they kind of dropped him down in the lineup, but I'm not 100% sure with that. So you could put Yashin as a top-line center if you want to, but I would recommend if you're going to move him up in the lineup, you could put Randy Robitaille down and him up, because obviously Yashin had a lot more points, but this was Yashin's last year in the NHL, so it's up to you on that front. We also have Trent Hunter on this right side on the third line. Then onto the fourth line, we have Aaron Asham, who's a pretty grindy forward. You also have Richard Park, who came from South Korea, and one of the only players from South Korea, I think, that ever played in the NHL. And Chris Simon, who was a big douche around this point in time. Because if I'm not mistaken, this was around the time that Chris Simon, I think Chris Simon took his stick and, swung it at Ryan Holig, if I'm not mistaken, of the New York Rangers. But yeah, Chris Simon was kind of a enforcer around this point in time and more of a grindy guy that didn't put up as much points as he used to when he was with Washington in the 90s. Then onto the defensive core, we have Brendan Witt with Marc-Andre Bergeron. Marc-Andre Bergeron coming over from the Oilers list like Ryan Smith. Brendan Witt being a physical defenseman. And then on the second pairing, we have Tom Poti and Sean Hill. And top six wise, we have a young defensive pairing of Bruno Gervais with Chris Campoli. Goaltending wise, we have Rick DiPietro, and what's interesting enough about Rick DiPietro is obviously this was the year that he got that insane 15-year contract that I don't think he's still getting paid today anymore, but he was getting paid till recently. So since you can't do 15-year deals in this, to take into that account for franchise mode, I gave him an 8-year deal at $8.45 million, so he should be getting paid quite a bit of money and quite a bit of term for an 83 overall goalie. So it's up to you if you want to try and move that contract, or you want to see if he could become that really good starting goaltender he was meant to be in New York. And then his backup is Mike Dunham. As for depth, there's only one depth forward for them, and that is Richard Zednik, because he didn't really play that much with them this season. He came over from Washington and played 10 games, I think. So he is depth, but you could throw him into the lineup if you would so desire and take out somebody like Aaron Asham or Chris Simon for that example. And for players I had to cut from the Islanders due to the constraints, I had to cut Sean Bates, but Sean Bates will be in the pre-deadline rosters. I also had to cut a young Franz Nielsen. I had to cut Eric Boganecki and a couple defensemen like Radek Martinek, which was a big one, Freddie Mayer, and Alan Rourke. Now onto the lines for the New York Rangers, who didn't really have that great of a season this year. I believe they finished just around 500, but they did make the playoffs, and they did take out the Atlanta Thrashers in the first round, which was a pretty big upset for the time period. But the first line is comprised of Martin Straka, Michael Nylander, and Jaromir Jagr, so a very good first line. Jagr obviously being one of the best players of all time. He should definitely be really hard to knock off the puck, and he should be able to put up a lot of points with this Rangers club. And then Michael Nylander being the father of Alex and William Nylander, and Straka being a pretty good player that had 70 points this year. Second line wise, you got Brendan Shanahan with Matt Cullen, who was only in a small stint with the New York Rangers, like he was barely there. And also Peter Pruka, who actually was not that bad of a goal scorer for this time period. He had 22 goals. Third line wise, you got Jed Ortmeyer, who I believe came from Nebraska, which is probably one of the only NHL players to come from Nebraska, so that's kind of interesting to note. He's playing with Blair Betts and Sean Avery, who came over from the Los Angeles Kings. The reason why Sean Avery has a gold total eclipse is because of the fact that this was around the time period where he was being a douche to Martin Brodeur and standing in front of the net and waving his stick around like a maniac, but that's why I gave him total eclipse, just for the memes. Fourth line wise, you got Marcel Hossa, the brother of Marion, alongside Ryan Holweg and Colton Orr, who are both enforcer guys and guys you wouldn't want to mess with if you got on the ice. Then onto the defensive core, you got Merrick Malik, who once scored a cool shootout goal through his legs. I didn't give him anything really good in terms of his deking, but I honestly could if I want to. But he's there. You have Michael Roosevelt, who's pretty good. Carl Rakunek, rest in peace, another one of those guys that were on that plane. You also have Fedor Tutin, who's a pretty good young defenseman at this point. You have Thomas Pock, who came from Austria, which there's not really a whole lot of Austrians that ever played in the NHL. The only other one being in this build being Thomas Vanek. And then you also have Paul Mara, who came over from the Boston Bruins in the Aaron Ward trade that I was mentioning a bit earlier. Goaltending-wise, you got a young 24-year-old Henrik Lundqvist, who's an 88 overall with high elite potential, so he should end up jumping up to be like a 90-something after 1 year. Hopefully. And in his backup, you got Kevin Weeks, who was 31 years old at this point in time. He was nowhere near as good as Henrik Lundqvist this year. He had like a 339 goals against average in an 879 save percentage, while Lundqvist had a 234 goals against in a 917. So you could see why Weeks was kind of not that great of a goaltender anymore. And then they don't have any depth, but they do have players that they did have to cut from their roster because of the constraints. So those being like Jarkko Immonen, Jason Krog, Brad Isbister, a young Ryan Callahan didn't make it as well as the young Dan Girardi, and then two solid veterans didn't make it, those being Darius Kasparaitis and Sandis Ozolinsh. Now we make our way on to the North America Future Stars, which are kind of an interesting team. As I was mentioning, this is a team comprised of future NHLers that played in the CHL or in college or university hockey in the United States. So you got guys like Brad Marchand, who's a 70 overall but medium elite potential because of the fact it took Brad a few years to make the NHL after he got drafted. You also have Jonathan Toews, who obviously made the NHL the year afterwards, and Blake Wheeler. Second line wise, TJ Oshie, Claude Giroux, James Neal. Third line, David Perron, Brian Little, and Bobby Ryan. And a fourth line comprised of Kyle Okposo, Darren Helm, and Nick Foligno. On the defensive end, you got Mark Stahl and Eric Johnson. Eric Johnson going first overall in the year that Jonathan Toews went number 2. You also have Jeff Petrie, who is not that good of a defenseman right now, but he has potential. It's because it took him a long time to actually make it to the NHL, because I think he made the NHL when he was already 23 or 24, so that's why he's a low overall to start off with. And he's playing with Luc Bourdon, rest in peace. This guy was obviously playing with the Vancouver Canucks organization in 06-07 for a little bit, and 07-08. But obviously, in the offseason of 08 is when he had his motorcycle accident and passed away at a young age. So rest in peace to Luke. I actually visited his grave when I was in Shippagan to pay my respects. So rest in peace again to him. He was a really solid player, and he probably was going to be a really good defenseman at some point because he was a pretty high up first round pick. Then on the top 6 pairing, we have Chris Russell, who blocks a lot of shots, so we gave him gold ice pack. He actually recently passed 2,000 blocks, so it's good that I gave him that. And we also have Matt Niskanen, who recently retired a few years ago, I'm pretty sure, at 34 or 35 years of age. Goaltending-wise, we had Jonathan Bernier and Steve Mason. Steve Mason had an incredible rookie season. A lot of you guys might not know about it, but he picked up a ton of shutouts with Columbus and stuff like that. Helped him get into the playoffs, but yeah, obviously since then he kind of dropped off a lot, and he, I believe, might be not retired yet. He might be still a free agent in real life, but yeah, Steve Mason was an interesting goalie. And in depth-wise, they have one goaltender, and that is Michael Neuwirth. Now, in terms of players I had to cut that I really wanted to make for them, I was wanting to make Milan Lucic for this team, but unfortunately Milan Lucic had to get cut just because a lot of these other guys made it to the NHL faster than him or had better potential. And then also we had to cut Jason Garrison, who was a guy that I was going to make as a 7th defenseman for this team, because obviously he's not better than any of these defensemen you see here. So Jason Garrison could have been another option. Now on to the Ottawa Senators, who went to the Stanley Cup Finals in this 2006-07 season. As I was mentioning, they are my favorite team, so I know this team quite well. The first line of Heatley, Spezza, and Alfredson, absolutely disgusting line. Like, this line also in franchise mode has a +5 chemistry boost, so it's pretty awesome and realistic because they had some really good chemistry, this line. Danny Heatley obviously scoring 50 goals this season. He also had 50 goals the year before, and he had 105 points in 82 games, which is absolutely nuts. You have Jason Spezza, who's a very good setup man at this point in time. He only played in 67 regular season games, so I guess he missed some due to injury. I don't really remember that. But he had 87 points over that span, so he was well over point per game, and he would have probably won like the Art Ross if he would have stayed, like if he would not have gotten injured that season. Like, he was so good at his young age. And now, obviously, he's in Toronto, which kind of sucks seeing him in Toronto. And then, obviously, we got the captain, Daniel Alfredson, as I was mentioning. Alfredson also had a really good year. He had 87 points in 77 games and was a +42. So this entire line was all over point per game. And they were like that also in the playoffs en route to a Stanley Cup Finals appearance. Unfortunately, it didn't result in a cup win, but a very good line. Probably one of the best lines of the 2000s easily. Second line wise, we got Chris Kelly, Mike Fisher, and Peter Schaefer. This was one of Peter Schaefer's best years of his career. I think it might have been his best. He had 46 points. And then also Mike Fisher was really good in some of his years where he scored 20 plus goals, 48 points this year. And then Chris Kelly was a solid defensive forward and had 38 points this season. Third line wise, we got Antoine Vermette, a very good face-off man and a very good defensive forward, also a very good skater. I remember him scoring some pretty nice goals back when I was a fan in the earlier 2000s, or mid-2000s, I guess, at this rate. He's playing alongside Mike Comrie, who came over from Phoenix to try and help us get a chance to win the Stanley Cup, and Chris Neal, who I made an enforcer with some good truculence, but he also has some good offensive stats, so he should be able to produce, which is something that most enforcers can't. But Chris Neal was that type of guy that could definitely pick up some offensive points if he wanted to as well. Like, he had 28 points this season, so he could actually put up points. Fourth line wise, we got Patrick Eaves in his second season, Dean McCammond at 33 years of age, and Christoph Schubert, which some of you guys might be like, oh, Christoph Schubert, isn't he a defenseman? Well, he was a defenseman, but there was a few years in Ottawa where he actually was used as like a fourth line forward, and I think this was one of those years because of the fact the other top six defensemen all played like 80 plus games, so he would technically be scratched otherwise, so I think he was playing forward this year a little bit, so I made him a fourth line left winger, but he would also play like left defense as well. Onto the defensive core, we have Anton Volchenkov, who blocked a lot of shots through a lot of hits, and he had the nickname of 8-Train. He's playing with Chris Phillips. Second pairing, we got Wade Redden with Andre Mazzaros, and on the top six, we got Tom Preissing and Joe Corvo, who were both in Ottawa for not too long. Corvo had multiple stints in Ottawa, but Preissing was there not too long, but he was also actually pretty good of a defenseman when he did play for the Sens. Goaltending wise, we got Ray Emery, rest in peace to him as well. Sucks that we could not win him a Stanley Cup, but at least he won a Stanley Cup when he went to Chicago, because obviously he passed away a few years ago. Our backup is Martin Gerber, who's also a pretty damn good goaltender around this time period. Well, he was 15-9-3 as the backup. It could be just the team in front of him, but this Sens team was really that good. And then scratched-wise, we have Oleg Saprikin, who came over from Phoenix in a separate deal, I believe, than the Mike Comrie one. But he is currently scratched because he didn't really play a lot of games with the Ottawa Senators. He only played in 12 of them, and then I don't think he played in much during the playoffs. Now, for Sens players, I had to cut due to the constraints. Josh Hennessy was one of them, which isn't a huge one because he was more of an AHL player. The biggest one probably was Brian McGrattan that I had to cut because of the constraints. Brian McGrattan was a really good enforcer when he was with this Ottawa Senators team. And then I also had to cut Lawrence Nicollet, who came over from the Washington Capitals. He was like a depth defenseman, so it doesn't really matter too much on that front. Then we go over to the Philadelphia Flyers, who were not a great team at all, and they finished the worst in the league, going 22-48-12 for 30th in the league. They just could not score enough goals, and they also allowed way too many. But they did have to get rid of Peter Forsberg, who would go to Nashville at the deadline, and that's why he's on Nashville in this. But if you guys play with the pre-deadline rosters, he would be on this team. So first line-wise, you got Simone Gagne with Jeff Carter and Mike Knuble. Jeff Carter being a young center, and Simone Gagne was actually still a really good player on this team, mainly because of the fact he played with Peter Forsberg for a while of the season, but he had 41 goals this year. Second line-wise, you got Scotty Upshall, who I believe came over in that Peter Forsberg trade from Nashville with Mike Richards, so another good young center, and Sami Kapanen, who is the father of Kasperi. Third line-wise, you got Dmitry Afanasenkov, who I think came over from Tampa Bay as a waiver claim. You got RJ Umberger. So some really good young centers, but a very weak team for the most part when you get to the defensive core, which you'll see in a second. And we also have Jeff Sanderson, who was near the end of his career. Fourth line wise, you got Todd Fedoruk, more of an enforcer, with Mike York and Ben Eager, which, interesting enough, my grade 4 teacher when I was in public school was related to Ben Eager because her husband was Ben Eager's cousin or something like that. So kind of a neat note there. And also my teacher from then also went to high school with like my parents. So a little bit of a weird tie in there. And then on the defensive core, we have Darian Hatcher and Yoni Pikkinen, so not a bad top two, but Hatcher was getting old at this point. Pikkinen was still putting up good points, so he's not too bad. But the top 4 pairing and the top 6 pairing weren't really that good. Obviously, you got some young guys. You got Braden Coburn, who came over from Atlanta, and you have Lassi Kukkonen, who came over from Chicago, more of a top 6 defenseman. And then the top 6 pairing, you got Alexander Picard and Randy Jones. So you can see why this team wasn't that good. That defensive core is quite weak for the most part. And at goaltending wise, you got Antero Niittymaki, who was there from the beginning of the season, and Martin Biron, who came over from Buffalo. And then in terms of depth wise, you got Robert Esch, who also played a decent amount this season before Martin Biron came over from Buffalo. For players I had to eliminate from this build, there include Ryan Patolny, Boyd Kane, Stefan Ruzicka, Darren Reed, Eric Malosh, so a lot of AHL guys that you guys probably don't even know who the heck they are. I also had to cut Danny Gauthier and Mike Rathje, but those two guys are in the pre-deadline roster because they did play a little bit during the beginning of the season, as well as UC Timonen and David Prince were cut. UC Timonen is the brother of Kimo, so that's kind of an interesting one, but a lot of those guys just got into the lineup because this team suffered a lot of injuries and they didn't have a great roster, so they got an opportunity to play this year. Then we get into the Phoenix Coyotes, and this team is pretty interesting. They did have a lot of players that they moved out at the deadline and before the deadline. So first line-wise, you have Nico Kapanen, but I believe they brought in from Atlanta. They also have Steven Reinprecht and Shane Doan. Shane Doan obviously being probably the best player on this team. Second line-wise, you got Owen Nolan with Mike Zigomanis and Matthias Charnquist, who came over from Dallas. Now, Charnquist is kind of an interesting player. He actually had almost a hit per game and a block per game in when he did play with Phoenix in 07-08. So this guy was a really solid defensive forward and also threw a lot of hits. So I don't know why he didn't play long in the NHL, but he didn't really have a long career at all. I think it only lasted 2 years. Third line-wise, you got Frederick Schustrom alongside Jeremy Roenick, who made a return to Phoenix at this point in time, and Kevin Adams, the GM of the Buffalo Sabres. Fourth line-wise, you got Patrick Fisher, who had a very short NHL career. Like, this was his only season he played, and I believe he only played in less than 30 games. And you also have Dave Scatchard at center and Josh Gratton, who was more of an enforcer. On the defensive front, you got Keith Ballard and Zbigniew McCulloch, who is the brother of Milan. You also have Derek Morris and Ed Jovanovski, and a pretty solid top 6 pairing as well, Nick Boynton and Travis Roche. So the defensive core is not too bad, but this team also finished really down there in the standings. They finished 29th in the league, so just behind, or just above, the Philadelphia Flyers. Goaltending wise, they have Curtis Joseph, who was in his, I believe, second season in Arizona, but he wasn't really there that long, and it's kind of weird seeing him in a Phoenix Coyotes jersey, not gonna lie. And his backup is Mikhail Telquist, who came over from Toronto, I believe, via waiver claim, if I'm not mistaken. And I do not have any depth, but I did have to cut a few players, including Joel Perreault, Jeff Taith, Daniel Carcillo was one of the bigger ones, Bill Thomas, Enver Leeson, and Matt Jones, as well as defenseman Brendan Bell. Now into the Pittsburgh Penguins, who are a pretty interesting team because they got a good youth movement going, obviously, and they do have some good veterans to play with their younger guys. So first line-wise, you got Evgeny Malkin in his first NHL season, alongside a second-year Sidney Crosby, so pretty nasty there, as well as Mark Recchi, who is in one of the last years of his career. His last year was in 2010-11, but 8 years of age at this point. Second line-wise, you got Colby Armstrong, Jordan Stahl, two guys that are in their first 2 years of their career as well. Stahl in his first, Armstrong second, but he's playing with Gary Roberts, who came over from Florida at 40 years of age, so another good veteran to play with some young guys. Third line-wise, you got Ryan Malone with Max Talbot and Michel Ouellette. Both these two guys also in their first 2 years of their careers, so you can see there's a lot of good young talent on this team. And then fourth line wise, you got Jarkko Ruutu with Eric Christensen, who was in his second season, I think, and George Laraque, who came over from Phoenix. Defensively, you got Ryan Whitney, and you also got Sergei Gonchar, so a pretty good top two pairing, but it kind of drops off a lot since, and you can kind of see why this team wasn't good enough to get past the Ottawa Senators, because you got Brooks Orpik, Joseph Melikar, Alan Nasruddin's a pretty weak defenseman to have, like he really didn't play that much, and you have Rob Scuderi. But goaltending wise, you have a really good top goaltender, obviously, in Marc-Andre Fleury, who is 22 years of age at this point in time, with high elite potential, 87 overall, so he should develop into being a good goaltender, and Jocelyn Thibault is the backup. And they do not have any depth, but I did have to cut a few players that they didn't want to cut, including John LeClaire, who actually played some time with them this season. He played in 21 games, but I had to cut them due to constraints. I also had to cut Nils Ekman, Chris Thorburn, Ronald Petrovicki, Mark Eaton, and Joel Kwiatkowski. Now into the San Jose Sharks, you have a top line of Milan McCulloch, Joe Thornton, who had an incredible season this year. Really good. 114 points for the big man in 82 games. Most of those being assists, but he was a very good setup man during this year and the year prior, and also onwards. But he was phenomenal. And Jonathan Cheechoo is on his wing. Obviously, Cheechoo coming off a 56-goal season and only scored 37 by comparison this season, but he still was really good. Second line wise, you got Bill Guerin, who came over from St. Louis, so he'll be on St. Louis in the pre-deadline rosters, as well as Patrick Marleau, the captain of the team, and Mike Greer. Third line wise, you got Ryan Clough with Curtis Brown and Steve Bernier, so two younger guys and a more veteran guy that used to play for Buffalo and whatnot. Fourth line wise, you got Patrick Rissmiller with Marcel Gottsch, the German, and Mark Bell. As for defense, it's a pretty solid defensive core here as well in San Jose. You got Scott Hannon with Kyle McLaren, Craig Rivet, who came over from Montreal, and Mark-Edward Vlasic, who's only 19 at this point in time and in his first season. And then on the top six, you have Christian Ehrhoff and Matt Carle. Now, Matt Carle, I think, was another one of those guys like John Michael Lyles that played power play time, but also played on the top six pairing. Goaltending-wise, you got Evgeny Nabokov and Vesa Toskala, who both had really good seasons this year. Toskala actually had 26 wins this year, while Nabokov had 25, but both of them had sub 2.4 goals against averages, and they both had pretty solid save percentages, and a combined 11 shutouts, so these two were phenomenal this year, and you can kind of see why Toronto really wanted a goalie like Toskala, but unfortunately Toskala really fell apart in Toronto like a lot of other players do. Depth-wise, they have a young Joe Pavelski who was in his first season. He only played 46 games with them this year, but he did have 28 points, so that's why he's an 82 overall. So if you are playing with San Jose, you might want to throw him into the lineup instead of, Marcel Gottsch or maybe even Patrick Rissmiller, but he's definitely there as a depth option if you want to use him. And also what's interesting is his jersey numbers change between the two roster builds, so he'll be number 53 in the pre-deadline roster, but after deadline roster he will be number 8 because he started the season off using number 53. Now for players I had to cut from the San Jose Sharks, there was not that much of them. There was Mark Smith and Rob Davison, and there was also Doug Murray, but Douglas Murray is going to be in the pre-deadline rosters. He was a really good hitting defenseman, but he will be there as well on this team, so you guys could use him in the pre-deadline rosters if you want to use him. Now we get into the St. Louis Blues, and this team went through a lot of changes throughout the year, so their roster looks a lot different than it would look like pre-deadline wise, but first line wise, you got Ruchinski with Waite and Boys coming over from Boston, Doug Waite being there for quite a long time, actually coming back from Carolina because he was in St. Louis the year before, but then went to Carolina for the Cup win, then came back, that type of thing. Second line wise, you got Radek Dvorak with Peter Kajanik and Lee Stempniak. Third line, David Backes in his first season, I think, and Jay McClement, and Glenn Metropolitan, who was a part of the Keith Tkachuk trade to bring Keith Tkachuk to Atlanta. And fourth line wise, you got Ryan Johnson, Jamal Mayers, and the captain of the team, and Dallas Drake. On the defensive end, you got Barrett Jackman and Eric Brewer, Christian Backman and Bryce Salvador, and in a top six pairing of Jeff Wojcicka and Matt Walker. So you can kind of see why this team wasn't that good. They finished 22nd in the league because they just could not keep the puck out in the net. Like, the defensive core is not that good enough. Barrett Jackman and Brewer are pretty strong, but after that, you don't really have a good top or bottom four, I should say, for defense. Goaltending wise is also not that great, and that might also be a reason why, as Manny Legacy is their starter and their backup is Curtis Sanford. Depth wise, they do have one goalie as well, and that is Jason Bekashwa, because Bekashwa actually laced up in 19 games this season but it was mainly because I think one of the two goalies got injured, so that's why he played, but he played a lot of games this year. As for players I had to cut for the St. Louis Blues, I had to cut DJ King, Ville Nieminen, Peter Sena, so those are two bigger ones. Also, Dan Heinold was a big one, Jamie Rivers, Jay McKee, and Roman Polak, so those were some pretty big ones I had to cut for the Blues. Then on to the Tampa Bay Lightning, we have a pretty solid first line. We got Valkov Prospal with Vinny Lecavalier and Martin St. Louis. This team almost missed the playoffs, but the top two players of St. Louis and Lecavalier were the main reason this team made the playoffs, because this year Lecavalier had 52 goals and 56 assists for 108 points in 82 games, so he would win the Richard this season. And Martin St. Louis was also really good this year with 43 goals, 59 assists for 102 points. So the two of these guys and pretty much Brad Richards on the second line carried the team in terms of offense, but everybody else was not nowhere near as good. Also on that second line is Ruslan Fedotenko with Brad Richards. Richards had 70 points this season, and Jason Ward. Third line wise, you got Nick Tarnasky, who is more of an enforcer, Eric Perrin, who had an okay season with like 30-something points, and Ryan Craig. And then fourth line wise is Andreas Karlsson with Tim Taylor, who is the captain of the team, and Andre Waugh, who's another enforcer. On the defensive front, you got Paul Ranger and Dan Boyle. Dan Boyle had a pretty good season as well on the defensive end. He had 20 goals and 43 assists for 63 points. On the second pairing, you got Corey Sarich and Philip Kuba. Top six wise, you can see he gets a little bit weak. You got Doug Janik and Nolan Pratt. Goaltending wise, you don't have a good goaltending combination as well, so that's the main reason this team didn't do that well, is because Johan Holmqvist and Mark Denis are both kind of like fringe starting goalies to an extent, and both of them didn't have good numbers throughout their careers. Holmqvist rarely played, not that much. Mark Denis was kind of more of a highly touted goalie at some point, but he didn't really become that good goaltender that Tampa Bay, Columbus, and Colorado wanted. Their only depth defenseman for Tampa Bay is Shane O'Brien, who came over from the Anaheim Ducks. But he has to be scratched because of the amount of games played. In terms of players I had to cut for Tampa Bay, there's only 3 of them. So Blair Jones and Carl Stewart, not too big names. But I also had to cut Luke Richardson due to the amount of games played, because he only played in 27 games this year. But he would play in Ottawa the year afterwards. So it kind of sucks that I had to cut him, but that was the case. Then we get into the Toronto Maple Leafs, and I always remember this type of team facing the Sens a lot. So kind of recognize this roster quite well. So first line wise, you got Nick Antropov with Matt Sundin and Kyle Wellwood. Wellwood was actually pretty good this season, but he missed a lot of time due to injury, but he had 42 points in 48 games. He also didn't take a lot of penalty minutes in his career, like he barely took penalties. During his 48 games this season, he didn't take a single penalty, which is pretty ridiculous to say that, but I think I gave him really good discipline, if I'm not mistaken. He had 97 discipline. Then on the second line wise, you have Alexei Ponikarovsky with Matt Stajan and Alex Steen, who's in his second season. Third line has Bates Battaglia, Jeff O'Neill, and Darcy Tucker. And the fourth line wise, you got John Pohl, which is kind of a weird player to have in your lineup, and Yannick Perreault, who came over from Phoenix, as well as Chad Gilger. Then onto the defensive core, you have McCabe and Cabriolet, who both had really good seasons this year. One had 57 points, the other one had 58. Then you also have Ian White and Pavel Kabina. And on the top six, you have Wade Belak. Rest in peace to him as well. He died too early in his life. Really sucks that he did it the way he did. And also Hal Gill is his defensive pairing. So a very physical defensive top six pairing for sure in terms of size and all that. Goaltending wise, you have Andrew Raycroft, who obviously came over for Tuukka Rask. I like to mention that a lot because Bruins fans will laugh, and Leaf fans will probably cry themselves to sleep thinking about the fact that they could have had Tuukka Rask. It is what it is. Backup-wise, they have J.S. O'Bain. And then in terms of depth, they have one depth forward, and that is Michael Pekka. Michael Pekka's only depth in this because of the fact that he didn't play a whole lot of games this year. He only laced up in 35 games, so that's why I put him on the depth. As for players I had to cut due to constraints was Travis Green, Boyd Devereaux, Chris Newberry, Ben Andrus, Alexander Suglobov, Carlo Korliakovo, and Andy Wisniewski. So some okay names there and some more AHL kind of names there as well. Then on to the Vancouver Canucks. This is a pretty good roster. This team finished 8th best in the league, mainly because they probably brought in Roberto Luongo, but it was also a pretty damn good defensive team, and they also, I think it was more of a defensively minded team, you could say. So first line wise, you have Daniel and Henrik Sedin. Both of them have the exact same X factors, except for one's a better passer and one is a better shooter. You also have Marcus Naslund, who is the captain of this team, kind of dropping off a bit because this is near the end of his NHL career. Second line wise, you got Brian Smolinski, who came over from Chicago. Brendan Morrison, and Taylor Pyatt. Third line wise, you got a very aggressive Matt Cook with Jan Bullis and Trevor Linden, and a fourth line of Alex Burrows with Josh Green and Jeff Cowan. On the defensive front, you have a pretty good defensive core. You got Matthias Oland with Kevin Bieksa, Sammy Salo with Willie Mitchell, and Lucas Krajicek with Brent Sopel, who came over from Los Angeles. Goaltending wise, you got Roberto Luongo, who, as I was mentioning before, I think is tied for the best goaltender in the build with Martin Brodeur, and you also have Danny Sabrin as the backup. In terms of depth, you got one good depth forward, and that is Ryan Kessler, who obviously could be in the lineup, but he didn't really play a whole lot this season. He played 48 games, so he is going to be a depth forward, but he could become a very solid center for you if you are to put him in the lineup instead of Josh Green, for example. Now, for players I had to cut for the Vancouver Canucks, there's a couple I had to actually cut completely from both builds, and those ones being Tommy Santala, Alex Edler, and Yannick Tremblay due to games played. But the other two I had to cut for this build were Mark Chouinard and Rory Fitzpatrick, but both are going to be in the pre-deadline rosters for this team. So if you use the pre-deadline rosters, you could get Mark Chouinard, and you could also get Rory Fitzpatrick in if you'd like to play with that roster instead. But keep in mind, you wouldn't have like Brian Smolinski and all that type of idea. And finally, to wrap up the NHL teams, we got the Washington Capitals. So as you can see, we got Alex Ovechkin, only 21 years of age, but a 92 high franchise. He should end up scoring a lot of goals in a franchise mode if you are to use the Caps, which arguably would be one of the most fun teams to do because of how bad they are, minus Ovechkin and Alex Semin. But you also got like Yuri Novotny there. Second line wise, you got Matt Pettinger, Boyd Gordon, and the captain of the team, Chris Clark. Third line wise, you got Ben Clymer, who I think also played defense. You also got Brian Sotheby and Chris Beat. And then the fourth line has Donald Brashear, Brooks Laich, and Matt Bradley. On the defensive end, you can see why this team also didn't do too good. They finished like 27th in the league. You got Brian Pothier and Milan Jersina, who Jersina I believe came over from Boston. And then on the top four pairing, you got Steve Eminger and Shane Morrison. And then you also have Jeff Schultz and a young Mike Green, who definitely has potential as well. So you could use him to build around if you want to. Goaltending wise, you got Ole Kolzig, who's 36 years of age at this point in time. So if you're using the Washington Capitals, you might want to look for a goalie pretty early on because Kolzig is getting close to retirement. And you also have Brent Johnson as the backup. And they do not have any depth forwards, but I did also have to cut some players from them, including Jakob Klepis, Thomas Fleischmann, Rico Fata, Eric Fair, John Erskine, and Brian Muir. So those are the NHL teams rosters. Now let's quickly show you guys the All-Star team rosters, and then we will get into each individual AHL team so you guys can take a look at who was added to the AHL teams, so you guys could use those guys in franchise mode to help you out a little bit in terms of your rebuilds and all that type of thing. But anyways, here's the Western Conference All-Stars. Not going to go super in depth with this because you guys have seen all these players now, but this is the entire Western Conference All-Star team. Pretty stacked team. Kind of weird seeing Yannick Perreault on an all-star team, but he was there. And then as you can see, that defensive core is pretty gross as well. Philippe Boucher also representing the Dallas Stars at home that year. He was really good that season. Like, I think he had over 20 goals as well. But that is a very good defensive core. And then there is their goaltender Luongo and Turco, and a depth goaltender of Mika Kiprusoff. So if you wanted to play against the AI, you could do East versus West, and it is a lot of fun. I've done it a couple times myself. And then the Eastern Conference All-Stars are arguably, they look a lot better than the Western Conference All-Stars to me, but both of them have 92 overall, so they're both evenly as good, so it doesn't matter which one you want to play with. But top line wise, you can see there's Ovechkin and Crosby, the two youngsters. But yeah, this is a very nasty team because Marian Hossa, who had 100 points, is on the third line in this team. That's how deep they are. Like, you have almost all 90s in your top six. And then defensively, you got like Sheldon Souray, who had incredible years, I was mentioning, and a lot of other good defensemen. And then goalie-wise, you got Ryan Miller and Martin Brodeur, and you do have a depth goaltender in Cristobal Huet. So those are the rosters for each and every NHL team. Now let's show you guys the guys I added to the AHL just because there is a few of them. And then we will get into the guys I added for the draft class for the first 3 years so you guys can see what you could be drafting in franchise mode. And then that will be it for this video. I've been trying to record this a couple times already at this stage, but my Elgato keeps freezing after a certain point. So I'm hoping that I'm on the right track, at least with this portion of the video. Okay, so in Abbotsford, which is Vancouver's AHL team, we did have one goaltender, that is Corey Schneider. So if you're playing as the Canucks, you do have a goaltender that you could grow into being a good backup, or you could use him as your starter at some point if you lose Luongo or Danny Sabrin. But yeah, he's got dialed in because he was a really good goaltender for a period of time because Corey Schneider was kind of an interesting goalie in Vancouver, but then he fell off a lot after he was traded to New Jersey, I think. Then you get into Edmonton, and Edmonton has the one AHL goalie that you guys would like to use, and that would be Devin Dubnyk. He's got starter potential, 68 overall at 20 years of age. Decided to put him down there. I didn't give him any X Factors, but if you want, you could always give him X Factors. But that way, if you're doing Edmonton as a rebuild, because that would more be a rebuilding franchise, I think, you could use him in the NHL at some point and then get rid of like Markkanen, or if you do lose like Dwayne Rolson, for example, that type of thing. Then we go to Belleville, which is Ottawa's AHL team. There is one goaltender, which is Brian Elliott. He's got dialed in medium starter potential, so he should develop into being a pretty solid goalie at some point. And then you'd have to think about losing Martin Gerber or maybe even Ray Emery. Now, also for like the memes and stuff like that, I put guys like Jeff Glass in that AHL team that they would have actually been like in the day. That way there is a couple AHL players that are actually realistic to the time period, but obviously their ages are just not correct. Another guy being like Sean Weller, who was playing in Binghamton during this time period. Then we go to Bridgeport, and Bridgeport obviously being the Islanders AHL affiliate, there is one goaltender down here, and that is Wade Dublowitz. He would probably make a good like depth goaltender in the NHL if you want to use him, or you could use him as a backup if you try and offload like Rick DiPietro's contract, or if you get rid of his backup, because you never know, you might just get rid of Mike Dunham. But Dublowitz could come in as a backup if you'd want to use him, or you could just play him in the AHL. Up to you. Then for Charlotte, which is the Florida Panthers AHL team, there is one goalie, and that is Craig Anderson. I made him an 80 overall at 25, so he might not end up being as good as he was in real life, but he kind of was a late bloomer to the NHL, so he's down there in the minors. So if you wanted to get rid of like Ed Belfour, you could play him with Alex Auld, or you could just maybe even get rid of Alex Auld and then replace him with Craig Anderson, up to you. But you do have a goaltender in the system in case of like injury problems and that type of thing. There's one goaltender down there in Cleveland for the Columbus Blue Jackets who doesn't really have much potential, but he is still a goalie down there in case you wanted a depth goalie or you suffer injury problems. You could call up Thomas Popperley. He's got AHL starter potential, and he's a 70 overall at 22, so he might end up being something decent. Like, he won't grow to being an NHL goalie, but if you run into injury troubles, you could always call up somebody that actually played in the NHL at some point. And then for the Grand Rapids Griffins or Detroit, you got Jimmy Howard down there. Now, I might up Jimmy Howard's overall or potential a little bit because right now Detroit would put him on the trading block, because obviously when you have like Dominic Hasek as your starting goalie and Chris Osgood as your backup, then there's not really any use to having a good goalie prospect like Jimmy Howard in your system. But I would recommend keeping him around if you're going to do a Detroit series, because of the fact that obviously the two goalies you have in the NHL right now might retire within the first 2 years. So anyways, that's that. And then for the Hartford Wolfpack, which is the New York Rangers AHL affiliate, there is a couple goalies as well. There's Steven Valaket, who also played in the NHL actually during the season a little bit, but he's a 78 overall at 29, so he's more just of a backup goalie. You could also call him up as a depth goalie if you want to use him like that. But there's also like Al Montoya, who could develop into being maybe a good high backup goalie for you. I don't know for sure if he'll develop, but he was a really high up goaltending pick, so that's why I gave him high backup potential, but he was more of a backup in his career. Then we get into the Henderson Silver Knights, who are going to be Europe's AHL affiliate. As you can see, I added some good goalie prospects, so Tuukka Rask, for example. Now, I could have added Tuukka Rask to like Providence, but I decided just against it to put him in Henderson instead. But he's there. There's also Anton Khudobin I added, and Sergei Bobrovsky. So you have like 3 different goalie options that you can use for a like rebuild in Europe if you would want to, or you can eventually trade some of them away for assets. I don't really know what you want to do with them, but they're down there in case. And then in Hershey, there is just a random AHL goaltender that really didn't play much in the NHL, and that is Frederick Cassavy. So he's down there, 31 years of age, 74 overall. So if you wanted to have another depth goaltender or another guy that would replace somebody if there's an injury, you could call him up. And then over in Iowa, which is Minnesota's AHL team, you do got one goalie as well that played pretty good during the season for a little bit in the NHL, and that's Josh Harding. So he's an 80 overall medium fringe starter. You could call him up if you'd want to, but the thing is with Minnesota is you got Backstrom already, and you do also have Fernandez, so you might want to let go of Fernandez after 1 year or 2, or you might want to try and trade away Backstrom. I don't know, it's up to you, But if you would like to get Josh Harding into your lineup, you could always do that. Or you could just get rid of Josh Harding, who knows. Maybe you want to trade him or just let him sit in the AHL like the AIs tend to do sometimes. Then in terms of Laval, as I was mentioning, there is a goaltender down there for the Montreal Canadiens, that being Carey Price, of course. 77 overall, low franchise. He was playing in Tri-City during the season, but I decided just to put him in the AHL, and there's his individual zone abilities and all that, but he should develop into being a good goalie. If for some reason he doesn't, I might have to bump his potential to a medium franchise just to get it to work, but there you go, you have a good prospect in the system if you're doing a Montreal kind of rebuild as well. Then in Lehigh Valley, there's a couple goaltenders as well for the Philadelphia Flyers if you're to use them. So you got Michael Leighton, who actually started the season off in Anaheim, and then I think he also played in Nashville. Like, he was waiver claimed a lot of times, but he's down there in the minors. And you also have Martin Houle, who doesn't have really much potential, but he's still a solid enough AHL goalie, I guess, to have around for your AHL team. Then we go over to Milwaukee, which is the Nashville Predators AHL team. You have Pekka Rinne down there. Now, I would recommend probably letting go of either Vokun or Mason after 1 year. That way you could get Rinne into the system. But if you don't play him fast enough, he probably won't develop. But he does have that potential, and he is 24 years of age, so there's a chance he could be like an 80-something easily after 1 year. So it's up to you on who you want to let go of, but I would recommend letting go of one of your goalies so you could get Pekka Rinne into the lineup as soon as possible. Then for the Ontario Reign, which is the Los Angeles Kings AHL affiliate, there's a couple of goaltenders. So there's Jonathan Quick, just to add to the goaltending pool, and obviously being one of the best goalies during this time period once he got to win the Stanley Cup with LA and whatnot. But yeah, there he is down there. And we also have Yutaka Fugafuji, who I just added more for the memes because he's a former Japanese goalie that played in the NHL for a little bit. And I think that would just be kind of cool to have him in this franchise mode. So he's also there, and he's an AHL fringe goaltender. So he's never going to make the NHL unless you decide to play him. But he's still a goalie down there, and he's only 24. So it's kind of fun and more for the memes. And then we go to Providence, which has a couple goaltenders which were fringe NHL goalies. You got Joey McDonald down there. He was waiver claim, I believe, from Detroit. You also have Brian Finley, and you also have Philippe Sauve. So all these guys are not really NHL caliber goalies, but if you wanted a goalie that uses a depth goalie, one of these three guys could definitely work. McDonald still has some potential, but I don't think he's going to end up being a backup goalie because he really never was in NHL history. Or in his NHL career, I should say. Then we head over to Rockford, which is Chicago's AHL team. You got one goalie, and that is Corey Crawford. Made him a 75 high starter at 22, so he should develop into being a pretty good goalie for you if you are going to use the Blackhawks, which would also be a pretty good rebuilding team. Then for Anaheim down there in San Diego, you do got one goaltender as well, that being Sebastian Caron. More of another depth goaltender because he played with Pittsburgh as a backup, but you could use him as a backup if you'd like to, or you could just leave him in the minors. Then we move over to the San Jose Barracuda, and they have a future goaltender in the AHL, that being Thomas Greiss. I gave him low starter potential because it took a while for him to be an actual starting goaltender, but he's down there in case you wanted to use him. I don't know if he'll develop well, but he's down there for your San Jose Sharks if you are to lose somebody like Vesa Toskala or even Evgeny Nabokov for that matter. Then in Springfield, which is the St. Louis Blues AHL affiliate, you have two goaltenders. The first one being Marek Schwartz. I gave him high backup potential even though he didn't really play much in the NHL. The reason being is because he was a first round pick, so we have him down there. And we also have Ben Bishop down there in the system. He was actually playing college hockey, I think, during this time period, so but I decided to make him, and now St. Louis actually has a goaltender that they could potentially build around if they're not doing too well in franchise mode. So hopefully those guys kind of develop well for you guys if you decide to take the St. Louis Blues franchise mode or decide to play with the St. Louis Blues at some point. And then down there in Stockton, which is the Calgary Flames AHL team, you have one goalie, and that is Curtis McElhaney. I might have to up his overall a little bit because he's a high backup at 23 and only a 75 overall, so I don't know if he's going to become that backup goalie he was in his NHL career, but hopefully he does for you if you decide to use the Flames, and maybe he could be a replacement for somebody like Jamie McLennan once McLennan retires. Then on to the Tampa Bay Lightning's AHL affiliate, which is Syracuse. You have one goalie, that being Kari Ramo. So Kari Ramo has fringe starter potential because he was a starter for a little bit in Calgary, and he's a 73 overall, so you'll see if he makes it. He did play some NHL games, I think, this season. So yeah, he's down there in case you want a goalie that can maybe replace somebody like Mark Denis or Johan Holmquist, because both those two guys are not that great. And then the final few goalies I added to the AHL include in Texas, Dan Ellis, who used to play for the Nashville Predators and stuff like that. He's a 77 low fringe starter because he was a starter at one point, but he's down there in case you needed a goaltender for like depth purposes. And then finally, to wrap up the AHL goalies, we head to Tucson for the Arizona Coyotes, or Phoenix Coyotes at this point in time. We have two goalies, those being David Lenevue, so not really much of anything, but if you needed depth goaltenders, you have him, as well as Mike Morrison in case you run into any injury troubles. So those are the AHL goalies I added for this 2006-07 roster build. So some decent ones there, and then some others that aren't that great, but in case you need depth, they are there just to help out. Now comes the fun part where we go over the draft class and the draft prospects, which you guys are probably most looking forward to an extent other than the main rosters. So let's get into the one starting with the OHL, then we'll go to the QMJHL, the WHL, and then there's a couple overseas in terms of the SHL, one in the Liga, a couple in the Allsvenskan, and then one in the United States. So starting off with in Barrie for the Barrie Colts, we have goaltender Michael Hutchinson. Obviously not much potential there, but still a goaltender option if you need him at the draft. And then also I want to mention before we actually get further into this prospect portion is that the fact I lowered the overalls and potentials for everybody that is in junior currently. So guys like Jacob Frasca were probably supposed to go in the 7th round, I think. He's lowered to an AHL other forward, so he should not get drafted in the entire franchise mode, and the AI should never draft him because basically the first 3-year drafts are all basically my players and then EA generated players. So yeah, these guys have like no potential whatsoever, so it shouldn't affect the draft class. But I recommend, if you want to make the draft class a lot better, is to set it to high quality instead of medium quality, because medium quality, they'll probably be like bottom 6s and stuff going in like the 3rd or 4th round, just because of the fact I removed a lot of players from this, like low top 9s and all that type of thing. So if you want to make your draft classes better, set the quality to high, I would recommend. But if you would like to keep it just the same with my prospects and in some EA generated guys, and you don't care if there's bottom 6s going in like round 4, then you keep it at medium. But anyways, that is that. Now on to the Guelph Storm, which have one defenseman on their team, that being none other than the LA Kings defenseman Drew Doughty. I gave him medium elite potential, 76 overall, so he should develop into being a pretty good defenseman for you in franchise mode. And there's his X factors and all that stuff, so he should be a good defenseman in terms of both ends of the ice. And then we make our way over to the Hamilton Bulldogs, and since the Belleville Bulls no longer exist like they did in 2006-07, I had to assign PK Subban to this team because they're basically the team that replaced them. So PK Subban is there with high top 4 potential for the year number 1 draft. He's a 70 overall only, but he should develop into being a pretty good defenseman for you if you are to draft him. He's also right-handed, so that also helps a lot because there's not really a whole lot of right-handed defensemen that much. And then he's got some X factors as well. Then we make our way over to London, which has a couple NHL players for the drafts. So the first one is John Tavares, who is in the year 3 draft. I give him high elite potential because he was regarded as like one of the next ones back in 2007 when he was with Oshawa and whatnot. So I gave him good potential, and there are his individual attributes and stuff like that as well. He should end up becoming a pretty damn good player if you are to draft him in the 3rd year. And then also we have from the 1st year draft, we have Patrick Kane, who obviously will go 1st overall in year 1. He's got franchise potential. He's an 82 overall. So you should be able to, if you get him at number 1 in the 1st year draft, you're going to be having a stud on your team, or he might end up going to a team that he normally wouldn't go to, because I don't think he's going to go to Chicago in year 1 if you're to play this. There's a good chance that he would go to somebody like Philadelphia or LA. Maybe Phoenix too. But yeah, that's Patrick Kane. He should be a pretty good player out of the draft and should simulate pretty well, I hope. And then finally, to wrap up the OHL, there's one other OHL prospect, that being in Sarnia, which is going to be Steven Stamkos for the year number 2 draft. He's a 79 overall high elite sniper. He's got really good shooting categories, and that's pretty much what the majority of his X factors are as well, so he should score quite a bit of goals. So yeah, that's the OHL prospects I added for the draft class. Now we make our way over to the QMJHL, which only has 2 prospects because they don't really have a whole lot. And they're kind of solid prospects, but should help you out if you need like goalies and forwards. So Jake Allen is one of them. He's a medium starter, 64 overall in Drummondville. He's got some decent attributes. Could be a starter at some point if you develop him good enough. And then the other QMJHL prospect I added was in Halifax. He's more of a high up pick, that being Jacob Voracek. He's a 74 overall, high top 6 forward, so he should go within the like top 5 of the draft, I would assume, unless you make it like high quality, then maybe he'll go later on. But there he is with tape to tape because he's a really good passer and also big rig because he's a big guy. So should be an interesting one to see how he simulates and how he develops in a franchise mode. So now that the QMJHL is done, let's head to the WHL where there's a couple players. So starting off with in Kelowna, I almost said Kamloops for some reason, but in Kelowna we have Jamie Benn. Obviously he was like a later round pick in the first year draft, like he was like a 5th rounder or something like that, and he won't go that high up or that late in the draft. So he should probably go top 5 as well in the first year draft. He's got high top 6 potential just like Voracek, and he's a little bit lower of an overall. He also has some X factors and should become a pretty solid player. So yeah, it's Jamie Benn. Hopefully he becomes a good player for you when you draft him if you decide to. And then there's only a couple other guys in the WHL, those being both goaltenders. The first one being in Red Deer, we have goaltender Darcy Kemper, who was actually like 19 years old when he got drafted in 2009. But because we need him to go in the 2009 draft, he will be 18 years old when he gets drafted. So the age is a little bit off, but it's more just so he gets drafted where he's supposed to go. And yeah, he's a 60 overall medium starter, so he should develop into being a starting goaltender at some point, hopefully. And then the final goaltender in the WHL is for the Saskatoon Blades, that being the best goalie in terms of the draft that I've made in all 3 drafts, and that is Braden Holtby. He's got high starter potential, 67 overall at 16, so he should end up being a pretty good goalie at some rate because he's really good with Washington when he was playing with them, but obviously he kind of dropped off a lot when he played with Vancouver, and I'm not really sure how good he's been with Dallas so far, but there he is. And there is his X factors as well, in case you wanted to take a note of that, but he's going to be a pretty good goalie for whoever drafts him in a franchise mode. So that is the CHL. Now we will head over to the European leagues. Like I said, there's not a whole lot of European prospects, but we'll get to them anyways. So in Breenas, there's another goalie prospect. There's a lot of goalie prospects actually that I've made because of the fact that I could still create more goalies and skaters to an extent. Jacob Markstrom's one. He's in Breenas, medium starter potential, 64 overall at 16. He'll be in the year number 2 draft. And yeah, he's a big boy, so hopefully he becomes that good goalie he is in real life right now because he's absolutely killing it with the Calgary Flames. Then we head over to Frölunda, which has 2 former Ottawa Senators players, those being none other than Erik Karlsson, the first one. He might end up getting drafted before Drew Doughty in terms of your franchise mode because he's got better potential, because I think Erik Karlsson's a better defenseman than Doughty to an extent. But he does have a lower overall, so keep that in mind if you want to draft Erik Karlsson. And Erik Karlsson's more offensively minded, while Drew Doughty's a bit more two-way, so it's a bit different there. But you could choose between the two of them if you'd like to draft one or the other. And then also another former Sens goalie in Robin Leonard is also there in Frölunda. Medium starter potential, 62 overall. And he should develop into being a solid starting goalie at some point because he does have some X factors, so he should be a good goalie. So that is the ones in the SHL. Now we head over to Liga, which has 1 prospect in Luko Rauma, that being a goaltender as well, because why not? That being goaltender Mikko Koskinen. He's not going to be as good probably as he is in real life. 60 overall, low starter. It did take him a while to get to the NHL, so that's the main reason why. He was drafted in 2009 when he was 21 years of age, so he's going to be another one like Darcy Kemper, where his age has been adjusted, but that's still, he goes actually in the draft year he was supposed to. So yeah, he doesn't really have much potential, and he also has no X factors because he's not really, I wouldn't say an elite goalie or a good starting goalie. He's an okay starting goalie, but he's also more of a backup too, to an extent. So that's the only goalie that is in the SM Liga. Now we head over to the final league, which is the Allsvenskan. There's a couple prospects over there that I added. One of them being way better than the other in Moto. And this is for the John Tavares draft. We have Victor Hedman. who should turn out to being a very good elite defenseman for you. Obviously with a lot of good X factors, and yeah, he's pretty much as good at everything: blocking shots, and playing defensive hockey, taking shots, picking up assists. So he should do a lot of good stuff for you, and he's also a really big guy, so should throw a lot of hits too because of his size. So yeah, that's a really good one if you can't get John Tavares, obviously, in the year 3 draft. And then finally, to wrap up the draft prospects, we have one other goalie in this, and then also one in the United States. We have Anders Lindback in Almtuna. Not really a huge name, but I threw him in because we needed more goalie prospects, so why not? He was one of the best goalies from this draft class, so I threw him in. He's got backup potential, 61 overall, and once again, he's one of those other guys that was a bit older when he was drafted, but he had to have his age adjusted because he was like 20 years old when he got drafted, so I made him like 16, so he'd be like 18 when he gets drafted. But so those are the prospects in Europe. Now we have one last prospect to show you, which is kind of a weird one to add, just like Anders Lindback to an extent, kind of a goalie that didn't really have a long NHL career and did take a while to actually get to the NHL. And this goalie was drafted back in 2007, which I didn't realize he was drafted that long ago by the Phoenix Coyotes. That being goaltender Scott Darling. He's going to be an American goalie prospect. So if you want to draft a goalie, he's got low fringe starter potential, so he might not end up making it, but then again, in real life, he almost didn't make it really either because it took him a while to get to the AHL level, and then finally Chicago gave him a chance, and that's actually where he made the NHL. So, and then he played in Carolina too for a bit. So that is the last prospect that I added for the draft, and that is for year number 1. So anyways, guys, that is it for the entire 2006-07 roster build. So I hope you guys really enjoyed this video. It obviously took a long time to make this video because it's over an hour long. It also took a long time to make this roster build and get it up to where I'd like it and all that type of thing. It took a long time to make that spreadsheet. So I'd appreciate any likes or shares or whatever you want to do with it. Also, I really appreciate it if you'd actually download these rosters when roster sharing becomes available if you are on an Xbox Series X or S. But yeah, really appreciate the support because more than likely this video is going to get a lot of views and likes and all that stuff. So I really appreciate the support. I really like doing these roster builds, and more than likely once I finish my 96-97 roster build, I will do an overview for that as well. There won't be one for the pre-deadline rosters for both rosters because of the fact that you guys will just be able to download them and they'll be pretty similar to the post-deadline rosters. So yeah, those pre-deadline rosters will be more of a surprise, I guess, for you guys to go in and see where players are and whatnot, but it won't be much different than the one I just showed you. So anyways, I hope you guys like this. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.